Hey guys, so today we're looking at a video called The Turkish Century from Hittites to Atatürk. Now, we've covered a lot about Turkey so far and the various groups of Turks throughout history. We saw a lot of map videos like about the Turkish War of Independence and the history of Turkey and whatnot, the Turks. So we've seen a lot of map videos. We covered some groups throughout the series, and now we're here with I guess this is just gonna be an overall view. I know as of right now there are two parts. There's this one and then there's the Republic one. So I'm gonna have to watch both. And yeah, these videos are long. Oh boy. I'm not gonna lie, I've been putting this off because I'm quite intimidated by long videos. If a video's like an hour or longer, I have dread watching it. No, not because I hate. By all means, keep recommending long videos. It's just like a personal thing. I worry because I don't have a streamer's endurance, and I feel like I tire out more. So, I notice, with longer videos, the longer they go on, the less talkative I become, the less commentary I give, because I don't have a streamer's endurance. I don't know how some people can, stream for, 8 hours. I kind of envy those YouTubers, because I, tire out after, an hour. So yeah, I guess I'm just gonna have to do it. It's because I actually don't talk. I know it's surprising because you guys only hear me chatter on, but outside of this YouTube channel, I'm actually kind of a mute. I'm really I guess you could say antisocial and introverted to the max. So I hardly speak or say anything to people. So I think that's why I probably don't have I'm not really good at talking for long times, because I really don't outside of this channel. Well, either way, this video ain't gonna watch itself, so we should really get to it, because I'm gonna probably be here for 2 hours. So yeah. Oh yeah, before I get started, if you want to watch the original video, the link is down in the description down below, from a YouTuber whose name I'm afraid to say right now, because I heard it's derogatory, or close to a derogatory word, so I'm not going to say the YouTuber's name, just to be safe, but if you want to check out this video from them, the link's down below. And if you enjoy this channel and want to help me out in any way, feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. It will really help my small but humble channel grow, and I would really appreciate it a lot. With that said, and now without any further ado, we should probably get to it, shall we? Let's watch The Turkish Century from Hittites to Atatürk.
What ties a people to their land? What makes land yours? How can land even be yours? The idea of the nation-state is barely 200 years old, and before that idea, the notion of land as a collective property of a cultural or national construct didn't exist. The land was owned by kings, and you lived on their land by their grace. The peoples who worked the lands had no rights over these lands, but were instead tolerated by kings, who themselves claimed to be tolerated by gods. The modern nation-state had to forge identities to justify their existence as sovereigns over said land. There are many means and ways to forge such justifications. Our most modern one is derived from adherence to common values or through an integration through language. Because of that, the academic histories of lands are mostly separated into two parts: the story of the land itself and the story of those who live in it now. And this place here is a great example of that separation. The region is now mostly known for the name given to it by its modern-day nation-state, Turkey. The geographical terms for it are Anatolia or Asia Minor.
You know, I have quite the fascination for Anatolia a lot. I've been looking at because so much change has happened in Anatolia, obviously with the Hittites, the Greeks, the Romans, the Ottoman Turks. Just Anatolia has been through so much, and it's such a historically rich place and unique in its kind of segue into Europe. So I don't know, I'm actually been incredibly fascinated by Anatolia. So I'll admit that this is actually the part I'm looking most forward to, because I'm guessing this is all gonna mainly be self-contained in Anatolia, which will give me a much better and in-depth look at this place that I've been kind of fascinated in for a bit. So yeah.
In Greek for East or Latin for Little Asia. And the story of Anatolia is a story separated into a part before those currently inhabiting the region and the story of those who inhabit it now, but also the stories of those that came before those that came before those that inhabit it now and those that came before them and those that came before those. Throughout the millennia, many came to claim these lands, mainly claiming it though through one thing, a right to land through conquest, as these lands are extremely valuable and probably one of the most sought after and valuable pieces of real estate in the Mediterranean. Surrounded by mountain ranges on all sides, the central Anatolian plains with its rivers and the downpours from the Mediterranean spill out into vast fertile plains that were ideal for early agricultural-based settlers, such as the Kraut civilization, around 10,000 years ago. The settlers of this region also discovered another enormous advantage of the region, the vast natural resources, specifically important for the first metal age that they would help kickstart, namely
Bronze?
the copper ore in the Pontic Mountains.
Dang.
The oldest known copper relics, which are around 10,000 years old, have been found in this region of Anatolia. Through digging up and dating copper relics, we know that this region of the world is the epicenter from which the Copper Age began. Being that copper was the most modern technology of the time, it turned the region into a center for trade and connected its civilization to the southern civilizations of the Halaf culture based in modern-day northern Syria. This trade was made easy through yet another benefit of the Anatolian geography. Anatolia is the origin of the two most important rivers in the Middle East, the Tigris and the Euphrates. Copper could be shipped downstream and traded for mirrors, pottery and grain that the succeeding Mesopotamian civilizations had to sell.
Wow.
Cometh the Bronze Age, cometh a new civilization, the Hittites, and the region developed into one of the most prosperous of the ancient world. If the Hittites or Indo-European peoples came to Anatolia as migrants or conquerors is not known. We only know that they came with the Bronze Age and stayed. Bronze is made 9 parts copper and 1 part of tin, which makes tin a resource in need. Again, this region is the epicenter of the Bronze Age, yet another metal age, but we do not know where the tin came from. There are large tin deposits in Britain, northern France, Portugal, Spain, Malaysia and Nigeria, which for their part explain the burgeoning Bronze Age civilizations in these places wants to know how reach them. But not so much in Anatolia. The origin of the tin used to make bronze in Anatolia is still somewhat of a mystery. Tin, due to its chemical composition, can form into tinstone or cassiterite, which, similar to
I remember when we covered the fall of the Bronze Age by Historia Civilis, he mentioned that a big part of like the Bronze Age culture was the great trading, because, you know, from Egypt to the Greek or Mycenaean Greece, and obviously, you know, here with the Hittites, that they all traded amongst each other, and that was a big part of how the world and the great powers interacted. Like, it was really, you know, trade, obviously, and with their resources and equipment was such a big part. So I'd assume that they got tin just by trading, and obviously the tin coming from like Britain and Western Europe. I'm assuming that the trade would just end up to Anatolia and to the Hittites. So, at least that's what I would assume, but I guess if it's a mystery, that's actually makes it even more cool in a sense, right? Because it's like, where did they get the tin from?
Gold can form at riverbanks in what are called placers that can be scooped and collected. Our safest bet is that this is how the tin was acquired in the river landscapes of Mesopotamia and Anatolia. The bronze made out of that tin and copper brought wealth, but also the Bronze Age collapse, during which the Hittite Empire fell apart into small bickering states to eventually be conquered by the Assyrian Empire. Even though often described as an Assyrian colony, it is far more likely that Anatolia was one of the more important and significant regions of the Assyrian Empire, and not just a foreign place conquered and plundered. A 3,000-year-old ship found off the coast of Uluburn, loaded with dozens of tons of copper, tin, bronze, gold, as well as ivory, point to the significance of Anatolia as an integral part of the Assyrian Empire, as do the various Assyrian artifacts found in Anatolia. Yet as the Hittite Empire declined, someone else also took up shop on the other side of Anatolia. Lydia appeared around 3,000 years ago and took advantage of yet another great geographic benefit of Anatolia, its vast coastline protected by mountains, ideal to go out and trade through the Mediterranean, but with the added benefit of the mountains providing protection from any potential invasion by sea. Lydia managed to fight off nomadic raiders such as the Scythians and Cimmerians, and access to the Mediterranean brought Lydia under early Greek influence and trade with Egypt, which in return allowed it to prosper. Meanwhile, on the other side of Anatolia, the Assyrians collapsed into bickering states at civil war that neglected many provinces of their once great empire.
The Assyrians are
which allowed
terrifying,
the Scythians and Cimmerians
by
to
the
raid
way.
its Anatolian lands, and eventually for the Achaemenids to roll in and take it all over. And here we reach a moment where history mixes somewhat with legend and myth. The last king of Lydia, Croesus, visited the Oracle of Delphi asking if he should go to war with the Achaemenids, to which the oracle replied, "If you go to war, a great kingdom shall be destroyed." So Croesus went to war with the Achaemenids, and consequently the kingdom of Lydia was destroyed as the Achaemenids conquered it. However, as much as the Achaemenids must have enjoyed their power over Anatolia, they didn't make it their new home, but a satrapy, where local Greek colonists and city-states increasingly resented their Persian overlords, which in return was a perfect justification for the Macedonians to invade the place and kick the Achaemenids out again. This began a long period of Hellenic dominance in Anatolia, however not through a united Greek ruler, but several states, kingdoms and entities, such as the Seleucids, Pontus and Pergamon, who warred and bickered over land and dominance over the landmass. It saw the arrival of the Bithynians in the Bosporan Straits, a Thracian people from modern-day Bulgaria who Hellenized and founded a city and kingdom at a strategically important position. The arrival of the Galatians, who were a Celtic tribe from modern-day Hungary who migrated into Greece, sacked several cities and then migrated into Anatolia to settle there. There, they would be neighbors to the Cappadocians, an Iranian kingdom in central Anatolia. Combined with an Armenian expansion westward, this shaped Anatolia's cultural makeup for centuries to come as a diverse place of many different.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Like I mentioned earlier, with all the regime changes, in a sense, of all these different empires who all kind of, inhabited it. And that's what makes it so unique. So much influence from Persia to the original Hittites, Lydia, the Greeks, the Romans, soon to be the Turks. Anatolia would breed such a unique identity, right? Culturally, from so many, holding a bastion for so many ancient great empires and civilizations. I think that's why I find it so unique nowadays and why I'm trying to learn more about it,
Different cultures, languages and peoples. And this multitude of cultures, combined with the strategic importance of the landmass, made especially the coastal regions rich and powerful. Greek kingdoms controlled trade from the Black Sea into the Mediterranean. Galatian mercenaries served in Egyptian armies, and the Armenian kingdom kept growing. Then came the Romans, who didn't drive anyone away, but simply made everyone Roman. Under the Romans, the wealth of the region didn't decline, but increase. More importantly, as Anatolia could be used as a base of power from which, through rivers and roads, power could be exercised over the Levant, Mesopotamia, and by that extent Egypt, the importance of the province that the Romans named Asia Minor kept growing and growing. In particular, the importance of its biggest city, Bithynia. Financial, political, and military power gradually shifted within the Roman Empire eastwards to Anatolia and the Bosporus Straits. Culturally, this changed the makeup of the Roman Empire in the east. It became more Greek, as the people in the cities were predominantly Greek. It is where the Romans started adopting Christianity, with a distinctive Greek touch to it. After the death of Rome's first Christian empire, the city which he had helped expand as the new capital was named after him, and subsequent emperors divided the empire into two, of which the Eastern Empire would be the only one to remain. As such, it endured further centuries centuries from its capital at the Bosporus, with its heartland in Anatolia, even as it lost much of its empire first to the Sassanids and then to the first caliphates. Someone, however, who is not to be seen in this, the first years of history of this mass of land, are the people who this video is about. They spent those years elsewhere, and at around 1200 they were about to make their great entry into this story.
Yeah, the nomadic Turks, right? Alright, so that was a good chapter 1 in terms of establishing, you know, the various groups and kind of what makes the makeup of Anatolia as a really diverse and culturally rich, also historically rich place with so much influence from so many different cultures all kind of meshing in. So, yeah, overall that was a good, that was a good, perspective look, you know?
10,000 years ago, our ancestors were all nomads. For the first several 10,000 years of our species' existence, man and woman were wanderers. The discovery of fire, the first to make tool flint, and those who painted the vast, beautiful cave paintings in places such as Chauvet in France, were people constantly on the move. And move they had to. The protein they relied on for their diet was meat, which is a more concentrated protein than plant food. Eating meat also cuts down the time spent eating by 2/3. But meat is harder to acquire, especially for a slow creature like a human being having to hunt creatures that are adapted to fleeing far faster predators than men. To be able to hunt such prey, it requires specialization and collective effort. And it also requires movement, because hunting cannot sustain a growing population at one spot over time. The extent to which a patch of land can sustain a hunting population is limited by the game being hunted, its cyclical patterns of migration, and that leaves hunters with the very stark choice of either moving with the game or starvation. Early humans didn't become nomads by choice, but because they had no other choice. At around 10,000 BC, something happened that disrupted the nomadic lives of many early humans.
The Ice Age?
The Ice Age ended.
Yes.
And with the change in climate and landscape that reshaped the world's geography, river valleys and vast fertile plains capable of sustaining agriculture formed that invited these early people in to settle. However, in free regions of the world, geography still lent itself to the life of the nomad. The plains of North America, the savannas of Africa, and the vast steppes of Asia. As people settled in the Fertile Crescent, the Nile Valley, the Indus River Valley, and the Yellow River Valley, the peoples of the steppe had no place to settle. The agricultural revolution of 10,000 BC also brought a new addition that affected the lives of nomads as well, the domestication of animals. Reindeer, goats, and sheep domesticated changed the nomad life from hunter-gatherers to herders. Through this, the nomads took upon themselves the responsibility of nature. Providing food for the herded animals required the nomads to continue traveling in search of pastures to graze. A nomad's life is a harsh and unforgiving life. Life is an endless ritual revolving around the animals. The horses, the sheep, the dogs, the goats take center stage in life and community. A tribe's value and strength are measured by its animals. Constant moving and dedication to survival leave little room for specialization, as all specialization is dedicated to the herd and the tribe. Survival requires a simple life as a nomad. Within settled civilizations, the surplus in food allowed for a surplus in labor pool who could specialize in masonry, metalwork, writing, governance, and more. However, specializations within settled communities have disadvantages compared to nomadic civilizations. A farmer is specialized to be a farmer. A mason is specialized to be a mason, neither are warriors. In comparison, a nomad will always be a herder, a hunter, and a warrior at the same time. Civilization also comes with civilization diseases, which most nomads avoid, resulting in longer average life expectancy for a nomadic culture. And at that
yeah, so I'm really liking the background, what's it called? The throat music? I've heard it called, like, Mongolian throat singing or music. I don't think I'm using the term right, but, you know what I mean. So yeah, it is kind of a cool perspective to think like how early humanity really we were just wanderers, you know, before we obviously with civilizations and regions, just established cities and kingdoms and all that. Um, yeah, it's really, it does put it into perspective just how on the move, we need it to be. And kind of, I like this breakdown that there are still places where nomadic lifestyles are still around, like the steppes and whatnot. Um, it's interesting. It seems like, the nomadic way of life was the OG human way of life, but then we kind of evolved to cities and, civilizations more rooted in one place. But that there are still groups of people who are kind of living the original way, to put it. I don't know. I think that's really cool. And, yeah, it kind of goes to show just how multifaceted the nomadic way of life is. You have to be several things. Like in some civilizations, you're kind of like brought up or to be one way, and you're only kind of gonna be that one way. And like, yeah, I like that what he just mentioned, that you have to be a warrior, a herder, and stuff like that. So many things. And I don't know, I just find that such a cool little tidbit of information that really has me thinking, like, wow, I don't know.
A nomad can also acquire technologies of settled peoples by simply taking them or trading them. One of the largest geographic landscapes in the world are the Eurasian steppes. They stretch out from the Balkans to the Pacific coast over a total of over 4,000 miles in length and up to 1,000 miles wide. This vast landscape is almost in its entirety flat, grassy plains, stretching out endlessly into the horizon, dotted with a few deserts and hills. Only a few mountains and lakes pierce through this endless landscape.
Wow.
There are no rivers to settle around,
Very
no
beautiful
large, fertile
looking
fields to irrigate, no mountains to build borders around, no boulders to make walls with, and no forests to log and build with. So the people who inhabited these lands remained nomadic as most others settled. And who these people were is somewhat hard to define. People are different from animals in that we don't just leave behind what we were when we die, but also what we made. And with nomads, there is not much being left behind. No buildings, walls, or castles. To nomadic peoples, everything is always used, nothing is wasted, and therefore almost nothing is left behind. The best an archaeologist can hope for are burial mounds, and what we find in them may contradict stereotypes that you may have of the supposedly scruffy poor nomad. The armor of the Golden Warrior can be seen in the Kazakhstan National Museum and was presumably worn by a Scythian warrior 2,400 years ago.
It looks
From Kazakhstan
beautiful.
to Ukraine to Russia to Mongolia, what we find proves considerable wealth and fortunes belonged to the tribes inhabiting these lands. But we also find arrowheads and helmets made of bronze and other materials. Metalwork, however, is a specialization that nomads don't have access to, which shows to us that they gained such either through trade, tribute, or force. Beyond the physical evidence found in burial mounds, it is possible to draw a map with borders detailing which nomadic tribe lived where in which parcel of these vast lands. However, for a people constantly on the move, owning land makes no sense. The idea of a border also makes no sense. The only border a nomad knows is an ocean a horse can't ride, a jungle a horse can't cross, a desert a horse won't survive in, and a mountain a horse can't jump over. And because of this, when speaking of nomads, the idea of a people or nation in our sense doesn't make sense. Nomads see themselves more in terms of families and clans, and in such structures, interactions between tribes of differing cultures are also different. A conquered people are not subjugated, enslaved or slaughtered, but simply made part of the tribe and the extended family. Marriages across cultures are more common and widespread than in settled civilizations. You can have a geographic estimate of where which tribe and people were active, but those estimates are often based on accounts by victims of raids. Through that we can place the Scythians, for example, in the land stretching from Ukraine through the Caucasus to northern Iran, as these tribes raided and plundered Greeks, Thracians and Iranians, who then wrote about them. But these are not to be understood as lands in the modern sense with borders, but more as a sphere of influence within which the Scythians were active. For the vast enormous steppes themselves, it is difficult to determine who was where, at what point, for how long. What we do know is that there were many. The Scythians, the Proto-Iranian Scythians, also known as the Sarmatians, the Proto-Slavic tribes, the Finno-Ugric tribes, the Proto-Mongols, and up there in the easternmost fringes of Siberia and northern China, we find where the Proto-Turkic people probably came from.
Yeah, I really like the in-depth look he's giving of the nomadic way of life. And obviously, again, that civilization versus the nomadic way is that I like the point he brought up about like how civilizations will leave behind monuments and stuff that we can look at, while the nomadic thing, the best you can do is hope for the burial mounds, right? But like you can't be wasteful. And again, with the borders, we think of like on maps, like, you know, we separate things like kingdoms and stuff and nations, but I guess, yeah, it's just they go wherever convenience holds them in a sense, right? Wherever our animals can, you know, pasture and graze and whatnot, and wherever our horses can go, we go, you know? So it's very much more pragmatic in a sense, and again, not a life, a life not of what. I'm sorry, my brain's frying. A life where wasting is not an option, you know? Though it is cool to see, like, the armor earlier, that I thought that looked really beautiful. And, what an interesting life, you know?
We know of them from this place because some of them still live there, still as nomads and still worshipping the ancient nature gods, and because they raided the Chinese, who then wrote about them. And what the Chinese had to write about these early Proto-Turkic peoples wasn't very flattering. Then again, the ancient Chinese didn't have much nice to say about anyone besides themselves. Based around the Altai Mountains in various confederations and tribes, these Proto-Turkic tribes would raid Chinese towns and castles. But we also encounter a problem through these Chinese sources. The exact ethnic makeup of the tribes they encountered is somewhat unclear. The large steppe regions east of the Altai Mountains were not just home to the Proto-Turkic, but also to the Proto-Mongol tribes. It is therefore sometimes unclear if a tribe or confederation of tribes that the Chinese historians describe were Turkic or Mongol, since ancient Chinese historians made no distinction and just called all of them barbarians.
Wow.
One of the first large nomadic confederations of the region was the Xianbei, and since the debate over if they were Mongol, Turkic, or a confederation of both is heated, and the answer unknown, I won't be trying to answer it here. The Xianbei were overthrown by the Rouran Khaganate, of which it isn't entirely clear if they were Turkic or Mongol, but it is more likely that they were Mongol. To the north of the Rouran Khaganate there was however a tribal confederation which we know was Turkic, the Xiongnu, and it is through them that the peoples of Europe and the Middle East had their first encounters with Turkic peoples when some of them migrated west in late 300, where they were called the Huns. This was the first large-scale invasion by nomadic people of Europe, and it instantly revealed the weaknesses of the type of warfare that the settled kingdoms practiced. Plate armor, heavy chainmail, tight formations, heavy weapons, and slow-moving military tactics were absolutely no match to the swift, fast-moving horse archers in light leather armor. The Huns
Yeah, horse archery is so OP, guys. I played this game called Mount and Blade Warband. I always play as a horse archer. It is just the funnest and most effective way to fight in gaming. And as we've seen, horse archers in warfare are just super, like, powerful. Yeah, and I kind of like that perspective. It's like, you know, anytime these, like, nomadic groups interacted with civilization, like, you know, stuck in place civilization, it usually resulted in quite a lot of trouble for said civilizations. You know, like the Greeks the Chinese and having to deal with that, and even the Romans, as we know with the Huns, and what a great terror they became and could have been had Attila maybe kept up his aggression. Um, and obviously we know other Turkic groups are responsible, like the Ottoman Turks are responsible for the death of the Romans. So it's like also the Mongols, right, under Genghis Khan. So it seems like whenever the nomadic groups of people united and just decided to go jump like the established civilizations, it always did result in great trouble and turmoil for them, right? So yeah, that's just really interesting. I guess it's that maneuverability seems to be kind of key with them, you know. Yeah, they're known for their speed, moving around, usually outpacing their opponents and stuff. Um, so I don't know. I find that a very interesting like situation, I suppose.
Also introduced the Romans to the recurve bow. This is as simple a technology as a bow bent backward, which increases the tension on the bowstring, allowing the arrows to be shot with more power and speed, which caused the arrows to simply punch through Roman armors, chainmail and shields with close to no effort. This bow was the result of the nomadic specific specializations required to improve a herd society's life. Hunnic tribes invaded Europe, Iran and northern India and caused the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. However, after defeating their enemies and acquiring vast empires of tributary states, a weakness in the nomad life was exposed. After conquering a settled people, a nomad cannot simply remain a nomad anymore. A settled people cannot simply be integrated into a tribe or family like a different nomadic tribe. And consequently the nomads are trapped into consistently patrolling a hostile land, worked by a people who increasingly despise their overlords. The Hunnic Empire stretched from the North Sea to the Caspian, but after barely half a century they were driven out by the people they had subjugated. However, as the Hunnic Empire collapsed into itself, the 5th century started with a flood of nomadic peoples invading and migrating into settled lands. The Bulgars, Avars, Slavs, Finno-Ugurs and the Hungarians came from the Eurasian steppe into Europe throughout the next 4 centuries. But unlike the Huns that preceded them, they all settled and transformed from nomadic peoples into settled kingdoms. And during that time, on the other end of the Eurasian continent, an interesting development was happening. The Ruran Khaganate collapsed and was replaced by the Turkic Khaganate, also known as the Gökturks. After defeating the Ruran Khaganate, the Gökturks would defeat the Iranian Hittites and consolidate power over almost the entire Eurasian steppe. From there, they would continuously launch raids against China and Persia, and it is possible that their conquest of the Eurasian steppes is what caused the great migrations of people into Europe as refugees from the Gökturks. However, by 600, their empire had split into two between a West and an East Khanate. The Eastern Khaganate would spend its history almost constantly raiding Tang dynasty China until it fell to the Turkic Uyghur Khaganate, which itself fell apart into various smaller Khaganates. The Western Gökturk Khanate also fell apart into various smaller Khanates and tribes, and amongst them, one would stand out and do something that no Turkic tribe had done before. The Tatars were Turkic peoples originating in Central Asia, and one of their tribes, during the expansion of the Göktürk Empire and its collapse, settled at the Aral Sea, expanded south into modern-day Turkmenistan and Uzbekistan, where they gave up being nomads and converted to Islam. The Seljuks. They became great admirers of their new neighbors, the Samanid Empire of Iran. It was the Samanids who converted the Seljuks to Islam. The Seljuks became increasingly fond of their new Iranian neighbors. They started dressing like their Iranian idols. Seljuk nobility started speaking Persian. They adopted the Persian alphabet, minted Persian coins, built castles.
You know, I like I said, I've been liking this comparing, contrasting with the nomadic way of things and the way of civilization, you know, and society, and it seems like the two can't fully coexist. Like, you can integrate the conquered civilizations and societies into your nomadic way of life. So it always results in the nomads having to essentially give up being nomads and establish themselves as a part of the said civilization, in order to essentially kind of assimilate into it. It seems like I can't think of a time where it was successfully implemented, where a nomadic group conquers another group, or at least a society and civilization, and then just continues being the way they were. Like, that it kind of has to be a change. Like, even like the Ottoman Turks, obviously, as we know, eventually just became stationed at Anatolia and whatnot, and had to adapt. And even happened with the Mongols. I believe one of Genghis Khan's successors eventually just became like, very influenced by Chinese culture, and then just created their own dynasty in China. So it seems like, that's kind of the trend, huh? So I find that super fascinating.
In Persian style, copied the Samanids wherever they could, and even formed a military alliance with them. Then the Samanids were overthrown by the Ghaznavids, which the Seljuks disapproved of, especially after the Ghaznavids tried to conquer them. So the Seljuks conquered them right back, and that became a watershed moment. Suddenly, they were the rulers of Persia. They, who had started as nomadic herders a few hundred years before, now were the inheritors and the heirs to the great legacy of Iran and all that came with it. Through this, their culture and the way they saw themselves radically changed, and with that, Turkic culture itself changed dramatically. At the time, the Seljuks were probably in the minority amongst the Turkic peoples, as having given up nomadic life and converted to Islam and becoming a settled people. But over the centuries, their influence through their empire would spread into creating a Turkish cultural sphere that stretched from China to the Crimea. As the Seljuks were sitting in their new Persian home, they boarded someone new, Baghdad, the capital of the once great First Islamic Caliphates, center of knowledge and trade in the Middle East, one of the greatest jewels a medieval empire could own, held by the Buyids, who happened to be Shia Muslims, so the Sunni Abbasids gave them the permission to conquer it. This moved the Seljuks into the center of the Islamic world, and with this they boarded yet another prize, the greatest they had seen until then. That last remaining piece of the Roman Empire in Anatolia, the Byzantines. And that prize no longer got out of their heads. Rome, one of the greatest empires of all time, the founders of European civilization, the pinnacle of what an empire could be. The Seljuks changed their imperial seal and battle banners to the double-headed eagle of Rome. They started calling themselves the inheritors and legitimate rulers of the Roman Empire and went to war, because there could in the end only be one Roman Empire. It went well at first. The Byzantines had recently declared the Armenians to be heretics to the Christian faith, so the Armenians didn't put up much of a fight.
It's amazing how the Seljuk Turks are just taking, like, identities. They're kind of integrating things from people, like, oh, we like this Persian civilization. It's kind of like adopt stuff about them, and then they see the Romans, are like, let's be Rome, just like everyone else. Since the West fell, everyone's just been like, I want to be Rome now, Oh boy, it's a never-ending trend. Everyone wants to be Rome. You're Rome, I'm Rome, she's Rome, we are all Rome. And it's funny, it's how so many of these Western and Eastern civilizations took the name Rome, wanted to be Rome, while hating the actual Rome and wanting to kill it. Is essentially, I want to kill you so I can take your identity. That's like identity theft. Very Tom Ripley-esque, Which I always find funny, like, man, we love this civilization, we want to be Rome, and then when they interact with the actual Rome, they're just so hostile and just, I think it's just jealousy, It's like, man, we can't be Rome if Rome's still around, so we gotta get rid of it. It's one of the funniest things ever. Eventually the Turks do establish the what was it, the Sultanate of Rome, in Anatolia. So it definitely, you know, that's a pretty big step. No pun intended.
When the Seljuks came to take the Byzantine Caucasian lands. From there on, they marched into Anatolia. They fought off and defeated 2 crusades called to defeat them. They lost Iran to a Persian uprising, but Anatolia continued to be their main prize. They came within miles of the great prize of Constantinople itself, but events that they could have never foreseen, in the very place they themselves had come from 3,000 miles away, prevented their final triumph. As in the steppes of Asia, 600 years of Turkic dominance came to an end. It took the Turkic people 600 years to migrate into Central Asia and expand from Central Asia into Persia and the Middle East and eventually into Anatolia. The Mongols only needed 40 years to conquer it all, as well as China. After defeat to the Mongols, the Seljuks fell apart into bickering little fiefdoms and states who all bowed to the Mongols. But far from this being the end of the story, it is merely the start of the next great chapter. Over the centuries, from 600 to 1200, the Turkic expansion created a vast Turkic cultural sphere of many a Turkic people. It stretched from Siberia to Anatolia, and as the Mongols emerged from the vast horde lands of the east, their conquest of Asia didn't just result in a mere subjugation of Turkic tribes and kingdoms, but in massive migration of Turkic peoples. From Central Asia to Persia and the Caucasus, many Turkic peoples packed and fled in search of refuge, and they mostly ended up in the lands of the Seljuks, thereby establishing a large Turkish population in Anatolia. The Seljuks themselves fell to the Mongols, and the 1300s were dominated by the Taifas, little petty kingdoms, warlords, and tribes that bickered and fought amongst themselves for control over the others and dominance. But they had a great advantage compared to the others defeated by the Mongols: the Zagros mountain range. Stretching from the Caucasus to the Gulf, this vast range of mountains protects whoever rules Iran, but it also locks them into Iran, making it hard to sally forth into the Middle East or Anatolia. And at a certain point it was simply no longer worthwhile to launch large expeditions to ensure the Anatolian Turks stayed in line. The most powerful of them was the Rum Sultanate, the successors to the Seljuk throne. One of the least powerful was a little state whose rulers originally came from Central Asia and had fled west from the Mongols: the Ottomans.
Oh dear.
The Ottomans. While much of the Middle East had been flung in
Oh, the Ottomans. Very humble origins. Little did we all know that they would be the biggest one, right?
to chaos through the Mongol invasion, the Ottomans managed to build a sphere of stability in their realm. This attracted craftsmen, intellectuals, and trade, while also providing the Ottomans with the stability required to go out and hassle others. Those others mainly being the Byzantines. But the Ottomans didn't just go charge into war as the Seljuks had. And of course they went through spats of conquest here and then, but the Ottomans mainly subdued the Byzantines through diplomacy, politics, and patience. They married Byzantine princesses, schemed within the politics of the Byzantine royal court, promised the Byzantines support against the Bulgars, Venetians, and Serbs, but used those promises to just take lands previously owned by the Byzantines, then conquered by others, and to not give them back. By the turn of the century, the Ottomans had established a firm grip over the Balkans and western Anatolia, and that gave them an enormous strategic advantage over the other caliphates and the Seljuks and everyone else who had come before them from the Middle East and Iran and attempted to conquer the Mediterranean. Access to the resources of these lands would further Ottoman conquest for more power elsewhere. It gave them a place of some tranquility as the Mongol hordes invaded Anatolia again. But to understand the complete significance, we have to look at maps and ships. Seafaring was extremely dangerous for most of human history and mostly involved coast hopping. You would sail along the coastline, always in sight of said coastline, and at all costs avoid the open ocean as much as you possibly could. The means to navigate the vast open seas were simply not available, and getting lost out of sight of the coast was tantamount to a death sentence. This, of course, cancelled out most of the Atlantic as any means of transportation by sea, but transport by sea was still faster and more efficient than transport by land, so it was still worth the risk heading out and hopping along the coastline. The Mediterranean, however, was different. It was mostly calm, but far more important, it had peninsulas, lots of peninsulas, all over the place. And when you look at these maps, it is also useful to forget the current geopolitical boundaries and borders. 1,000 years ago, the concept of Europe as a uniform entity of some shared culture or values would have made no sense. What, however, would have made sense would have been to categorize the region around the Mediterranean as its own entity, a kind of Mediterranean sphere of culture and influence. People in the Levant would have had more interactions with people in Sicily than people in Sicily would have had with people from the North Sea. Add to that the Egyptian breadbasket, and you have a region that many empires came to try and rule for themselves. Especially in these regions, the Adriatic, the Aegean, the Black Sea, and in particular, the Dardanelles. In these waters, it is close to impossible to get lost at sea. Almost like lakes, no matter where you head, you will almost certainly, at some point, hit land in close vicinity. This means that you didn't need to hop along the coastline as much, and that you could tax, police, and control all traffic going through these segments of ocean. This allowed for specialization in nautical transport and warfare, and consequently, it should not surprise you that prior to the 16th century, most European and Middle Eastern empires happened to be those who controlled those straits. This is a great springboard to go out and conquer the rest of the Mediterranean. And what about the Mediterranean? What makes it so special?
Yeah, I'm glad he brought it up. Just like the geography of the ships and the mindset. That's new. I haven't heard of that. That no one wanted to be in open sea where you couldn't see land in any degree. Yeah, that's interesting. I guess that's what makes the age of exploration even much more cooler. It's when everyone in Europe and the Mediterranean really stepped out of their comfort zone in a sense, you know? And, yeah, so I went to Greece last May, and I did some island hopping. I mainly went through plane, though. Me and my mom, did use a ship one time, and we were at sea for like 1 hour. And yeah, we couldn't handle it. We were in those big ships. We were from Naxos. I forgot where we were going to. Was it Samos? Or I think. I can't remember. We definitely took a ship, and that's like yeah, seafaring was an hour away. But it is comforting that you could see land at the distance and stuff. And it's less intimidating in a sense, and if you just see an endless ocean, right? As a guy who is afraid of the sea myself, I kind of relate with that fear in a lot of ways, actually. That's why that's the one and only time I ever went on a ship, so we were like, me and my mom after that, because we got sick, like, oh, it feels uncomfortable, we're like, you know what, we'll just take planes to each island we can, so it's kind of cool to see this and feel like I was there, you know? Like I said, my trip to Greece was very humbling, because I'm like, wow, so much history has happened here, so much here in this, sea, the Mediterranean, and I even got close to Anatolia. I was at the island of Samos, and, that's the closest I got to step foot on Anatolia. Obviously, it's not Anatolia, but you know what I mean, the closest I got to it, which is, like, really cool. And one of these days, I would like to go back to Europe, though I might have to go alone. My mom's not really interested in the Mediterranean. She's more interested in, like, the American continent and stuff, but I'm, like, I have a huge fascination. That's why I visited France and Greece. Like, I have such a huge fascination for this region. So yeah.
it is again the fact that ocean travel was limited to coast hopping. To the people of the time, the oceans were vast, deep pits of certain death. Siberia was empty horde lands with close to no means of large-scale transportation. So if you owned the eastern Mediterranean, you controlled all trade between west and east, be it the spices from India or silk from China. All of it had to go through the eastern Mediterranean. And if you controlled that, you could tax it. Before the 17th century, the geography of the eastern Mediterranean was geography that made its owners superpowers. Then there's also the breadbasket, specifically Mesopotamia and Egypt. Both these regions have the benefit of the most fertile lands in the region combined with a mild climate. This consistently produced the regular surplus in grain, which in return could feed vast empires, while most lands elsewhere had to consistently face regular famines due to crop failures and other agricultural disadvantages. Those who owned Egypt could guarantee a regular, not just supply, but a surplus of food for its own population, allowing them to focus their attention elsewhere.
That's why everyone always wanted to conquer Egypt. Right?
So
much
entity that represents
food.
an Islamic force trying to conquer Europe. The reality of the matter is that the Ottomans mainly pursued rule over the Mediterranean, because most powers before them had done so as well, and because of the enormous geopolitical value of the Mediterranean before the 1700s. And the first step to controlling the Mediterranean was completed by the 1450s, when the Ottomans ended the Byzantines and controlled most of the Balkans, Marmara, the Bosporus, and the Aegean coastline. The Ottomans made Constantinople their new capital and transformed the city dramatically. Under the Byzantines, the city had stretched along the southern end of the Golden Horn. Under the Ottomans, over the next 2 centuries, the city expanded into all directions to include the entire Golden Horn and both sides of the Bosporan Straits. The massive city would come to dominate international trade for the next 200 years, and also would be the harbour from which an enormous Ottoman fleet would try to conquer and control the Mediterranean. Beginning what we now know as the Era of Transformation. That massive navy helped conquer the Black Sea coastline and Crimea, as well as solidify Ottoman control over Greece. Meanwhile in the south, Egypt and the Levant had been ruled by the Mamelukes, an incompetent series of squabbling dynasties that were unable to put up much resistance to an Ottoman conquest of their lands, which then pushed further to conquer North Africa, Mesopotamia, and Arabia, from where the last of the Abbasid caliphs was dragged to Istanbul to abdicate the title of caliph to the Ottoman Sultan. With that done, they were now the center of the Islamic world. They controlled and taxed all Silk Road trade to Europe, had the largest navy in the Mediterranean, and they had access to the Indian Ocean, which they would also try to control. But there's something important which we might be missing here. People tend to live in a society. We can look at maps and economics as much as we want, but fundamentally an empire or nation-state construct of any sort is always a society, and without a coherent social fabric holding it all together, societies tend to collapse into themselves. So what was this Ottoman society like, and how did the social fabric of this society keep such a large and diverse empire together for 400 years? The reason is because at the time, it was one of the few empires that actually had a social structure that could sustain an empire. It tolerated differences. It is easy to forget that before the 1900s, Anatolia's population was 1/3 non-Muslim. In general, there were times at which this Islamic caliphate had a larger Christian population than a Muslim population. On average, Greeks living in the Ottoman Empire were wealthier than the average Turks, because the Greeks had built a large network of trade over centuries that the Ottomans didn't just take from them, but just taxed. Armenian craftsmen helped build the Ottoman navy and their new expanded capital, Istanbul. And the reason for this is because under the Islamic laws, which were the laws of the empire, all these groups were tolerated. We also have to keep in mind that in that time, group identities barely ever exceeded across the borders and limitations of the village that a person resided in. A concept such as a nationalistic tribal identity built on grounds of language or ethnicity wasn't prevalent. And people to an empire are first and foremost one thing, a resource, probably the most valuable resource there is. And the Ottomans were one of the few empires of the time who understood that and welcomed that resource wherever they could receive it. When Spain expelled its Jews, it was the Ottomans who jumped in to welcome them. And that tolerance that made life in a religious hierarchy possible gave the Ottomans enormous advantages over their contemporaries. Arab caliphs.
You know, tolerance feels like it's almost necessary for an empire to actually continue. Like, you think of the Romans, right? The pinnacle of what an empire could be, which I must say, wonderfully put sentence there, that he said. And the Romans gave citizenship to anybody anyone could be a Roman, and there's an idea of a lot of tolerance, and tolerance is kind of needed, especially since, like, the idea of, the Greeks are Greeks, they speak Greek and all that, and like he mentions that, like, back then, that identity, that how we separate ourselves by territory and stuff that we have nowadays wasn't, like, so prevalent back then. You just had an empire that just had many people, different groups of people in it, and that tolerance is why the Ottomans succeeded, and it's why the Romans succeeded, and I like he's bringing that up, because it's true. Like, you see why some empires can flourish, and you see why the Ottomans lasted for so long. So I feel like it's almost like a key trait. You need to kind of welcome the differences of people and kind of allow them to still thrive under you, so they don't, like, well, sure, we're technically under their banner, but things are still going pretty well, so we'll continue, like good management in a sense.
Faiths, in comparison, tended to overly stigmatize non-Muslim groups, enforced Arab tribal structures over subjects, and were regularly subjected to anti-Jewish programs and expulsions. Europe was at that time consumed by religious hatred. If you were Catholic, living in Protestant lands was not a good idea, neither was the reverse. The resulting conflicts bogged Europe down into massive bloodlettings such as the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War that stifled innovation and expansion. While within the Ottoman Empire, differing religious groups were tolerated, and this gave the Ottomans an enormous benefit in building and sustaining internal stability, but to also take advantage of external conflict. When the Ottomans, for example, marched on Vienna, they were joined and supported by Hungarian Protestants, who no longer wished to live under Austrian Catholic Habsburg rule. On a side note, there's an Austrian racial slur for Hungarians that developed out of this historic event, Kruzi-Türken, which means cross-carrying Turks. But it would be unwise, as many unfortunately do today, to see this as a glorified, tolerant Islamic past. For one, and probably most importantly, there's a big difference between being tolerated and having rights as a person. The main difference being that one of them is a long list of guarantees to you as a person for your safety, life and well-being. The other is a list of all the things you cannot do, mostly dictated by a majority to an oppressed minority. The tolerance under the Ottomans, from our modern lens, was preferable to the intolerance of its neighbors, but it was just that, a condescending tolerance. Under Sharia law, a non-Muslim is a lesser being. A non-Muslim pays special taxes, has no access to legal protections that Muslims may have. His testimony against a Muslim will always be rejected in courts, which by extension means Muslims have a free hand to commit crimes against non-Muslims without facing any consequences. Non-Muslims are forbidden from owning a means of transportation, are forbidden from building new houses of worship, were forbidden from publicly practicing their faith, and lived in segregated ghettos. From our modern lens, this is unacceptable, but even this discriminatory standard of living was preferable over the chaos and madness of Europe at the time, where worshipping the wrong god simply got you burned alive. If you were to travel back through time into the Ottoman Empire at the height of its power, calling the first official you encountered a Turk or even an Ottoman would have earned you a weird look, and the response, "You are in the Roman Empire," as that is what the empire saw itself as, after taking Constantinople.
Yeah, I know about Mehmed. After Mehmed conquered Constantinople, I think he took the title of Rome. So it's interesting that the Ottomans were like, "We are the new Rome." That's the history of the world since the fall of the West. Everyone's like, "We're Rome now." Like, I don't know. And if everyone's Rome, then nobody's Rome. So yeah. Again, okay. Yeah, the tolerance I said was good, but obviously, through our modern lenses, the lack of rights is bad. I know things were different back then, but, the fact that that's still better than Europe speaks volumes, right? Because, like, these lack of rights, we would look at it like injustice. This is injustice. Meanwhile, they're like, well, it's better than what the heck's going on in Europe, because we covered the 30 Years War and kind of touch on the 80 Years War. It's like, yeah, things were wild, so probably for the best. Like, I would go to the Ottomans too. What the heck? Like, I don't want to be in Europe. Screw that noise, right? So, yeah, that kind of goes to show you just how bad things were in Europe. I find that hilarious, you know?
Constantinople, they proclaimed themselves to be the legitimate heirs of the Roman Empire. This was also a society of multiple languages, from Turkish to Persian to Arabic to Armenian, Greek and Hebrew. And languages were also separated by class, not only within the Islamic religious hierarchy, but by social status. Few people outside of the Ottoman Arab lands spoke Arabic. The language was reserved to be the language of religion and the mosque. The commoners spoke Turkish, but the Sultan, the royal family and the royal court all spoke Persian, as they had held on to the court traditions and practices of the Seljuks, and also saw themselves as the legitimate rulers of Iran. Which leads us to another often overlooked fact. We like to often think of the Ottomans as the great rivals of Russia or the Habsburgs, but the reality is that they mostly fought their wars with dynasties ruling Iran, as they wished to incorporate Iran into their empire. The Ottoman transformation period lasted for 2 centuries, throughout which it was at the height of its reach and the predominant power of the hemisphere. But as we all know, that empire came to gradually, over the course of its remaining 2 centuries, to collapse into itself. It is often somewhat hard to deduct and find the reason for why an empire collapses. First and foremost, it is something that is in our day and age very easily exploited for very cheap political nonsense shots. The Roman Empire is a great example of this. I am sure many of you have seen that Michael Moore movie, where he draws comparisons between the supposed decadence of the late Roman Empire and the United States, or some drooling right-wing YouTuber claiming immigration caused the Roman Empire to collapse. However, when the Roman Empire collapsed, it was at the height of Christianity's power in the empire, when most of the things we consider to be decadent had been abolished. And the Romans purposefully sought out the conquest and settling of foreign peoples who they could then use as a resource. The list of reasons for why this empire collapsed is immensely long, and many of these reasons are often overlooked by hacks who seek to make cheap political points. By the 3rd century, the wealthiest Romans had basically stopped paying taxes, which made paying large armies to patrol the borders close to impossible. There is the in a previous chapter mentioned recurve bow, the fact that the Romans offered the Goths lands as vassals in exchange for an alliance against the Huns, and after defeating the Huns, betrayed that promise, to which the Goths reacted by pillaging Roman lands. The fact that the Eastern Roman Emperor Theodosius invaded and sacked the West because it tolerated non-Christians and even appointed them as senators, a war from which the West barely recovered. This leads us to one of the most overlooked reasons, the increasing fanaticism of the Roman Christian churches, which in the final century of Rome's existence persecuted non-Christians and made such incredibly wise decisions as declaring bathing, and by that extent personal hygiene, to be a satanic ritual. Gee, I wonder where all those late Roman plagues came from. In summary, there's a long list of reasons for why some nations...
Yeah. Also, the Romans were kind of just a huge mess by the end. Like, you know, as much as I like Rome, yeah, it was a huge mess, dude. So, and you can point to a lot of issues to it, right? Which kind of makes it, the fact that it lasted as long, kind of impressive, considering that they were such a crap show, that they managed to just continue existing despite all of it, you know? I don't know, I find that kind of oddly impressive in its own way.
fail, and some of these reasons are unfortunately easily abused, and others easily overlooked. History is never simple, and the reason for why historic events happen are also often never simple. When it comes to the Ottoman Empire in popular history, the moment mostly used as the supposed beginning of the decline is the failed siege of Vienna. But that is really not the moment to realistically choose. This was an extraordinary event, one of the few moments where European states that usually were enemies were able to unite in a common cause. So it makes for a nice story, something that sounds nice and appeals to visions that people may have of the past and present as civilizational struggles between vague concepts of cultures. But it leaves out a fundamental fact, which is that even after this defeat, the Ottoman Empire was still at the peak of its strength and would remain a powerhouse for almost 2 more centuries. Let me instead posit to you 3 alternative reasons for why the Ottoman Empire declined. Technological, geographic, and social. The compass, the cross-staff, and the carvel. The compass helped you know where you were going. The cross-staff helped you figure out where you are. And the carvel was a way to build a ship that allowed it to go faster, with more cargo, and deep into the oceans. Suddenly, those vast pits of certain doom and death turned into free highways, and those highways led to new lands, which in their turn brought something new to Europe. The potato, the tomato, and corn. These new cash crops were not as frail and vulnerable as wheat. The Europeans suddenly had their own bread baskets that could sustain a surplus in food, and the technological advances in deep-water navigation also impacted geography, not physically, but its usefulness. If you wanted to buy Chinese silk or Indian spices, you had to pay the tariff set by the Chinese, Mughals, Safavids, Ottomans, and Venetians. These products ended up being luxuries due to the resulting large price tag, and the Ottomans controlled that trade route, so a lot of the money went to them. Then the Portuguese simply sailed around Africa and them, cutting out all the middlemen and bringing vast fortunes. The strategic importance of the Mediterranean, which had helped the Ottomans so much, was suddenly a trap. Now they were closed in and limited by that small ocean, and
that's called the Age of Discovery, right? Where people started going like everywhere else. They stepped out because, as you mentioned before, the Mediterranean kind of was the center of their world. Everything happened there, and whoever held it all, you know? So, seeing just the influence of this exploration, and we did cover the Portuguese-Ottoman Wars as well, and like how that went down. That puts into such great perspective, I feel, of a good reason for decline, simply because, yeah, people found a way to cut the middleman, as he just said, and managed to get what they needed without the Ottomans, so their prestigious position now was not so prestigious. Wow. That's a great way to put it. I'm liking the way he's breaking it down of their decline, you know, in a more realistic sense. Because he does mention, yeah, sometimes we do have a way of oversimplifying the fall of civilizations and empires like the Romans. But in truth, you could write entire novels based on why the Romans fell, you know? So yeah, I kind of really do like that perspective.
couldn't break out into the open oceans. This brings us to a battle and a war which I believe were more significant than the siege of Vienna. For the Ottomans to break out of the Mediterranean, they would have to conquer and control the entire Mediterranean. So they went to war with Venice, the Papal States, Genoa and Spain, and were shattered at the Battle of Lepanto, where the recently developed new naval technologies proved their worth. The massive and powerful Ottoman navy that had controlled the Mediterranean for centuries consisted of rowing galleons, meant to board enemy vessels and fight hand to hand. Spain sailed in with cannon-laden sailing galleons that laid waste to the outdated Ottoman navy. Ottoman dominance of the Mediterranean was thereby broken, and they were restricted to a sphere of influence around the easternmost parts of the Mediterranean. Another path to break out was through the Gulf into trying to dominate and seize control of the Indian Ocean. This resulted in a 20-year war with the Portuguese-Ethiopian alliance, which the Ottomans lost. Trapped by the limitations of their geography and technology, the Ottomans became prisoners of their own empire, unable to expand beyond.
I love that way, that perspective he just put. Like, again, this is just, like, eye-opening to me. and I'm really loving this information that he's sharing because it's true. Their greatest strength became their prison, and there's something so poetic and beautiful about that. And realizing you do see the loss of dominance, like the sea, right? You see the innovation of like Western Europe in terms of seafaring, and just crushing the Ottomans in that regard. That really is just really cool, you know? But man, that puts it in perspective, like, yeah, without control of the entire Mediterranean, they essentially do become quite trapped and more irrelevant as new sea trading routes open. So wow, that's just a great way to put it.
Its limitations. But there's also a social change which contributed to eventually undermining the Ottoman Empire. This is St. Hedwig's Cathedral in Berlin. It's just one of many cathedrals all across many European cities, but this one is somewhat special. Starting construction under Frederick II of Prussia, intent as being a temple for all religions to share as a common house of worship, it would be the first Catholic cathedral in a Protestant land. Gradually, after a few centuries of slaughtering each other over who was worshipping the right god, Europeans realized that this was silly and instead found other silly reasons to slaughter each other. The extreme religious intolerance that had existed in prior centuries started to gradually wither away. The Ottomans thereby started losing their monopoly on tolerance. In 1774 came a
Yeah, that's kind of the thing. The Ottomans thrived when Europe was at its most divided, right? When they could play off the Europeans against each other. When the Europeans were fighting each other, the Ottomans would just kind of swoop in and take advantages. And yeah, with the loss of that, you do see a large loss of the Ottoman power. Once Europe, especially when Europe set its eyes on the empire and started, like, just taking away and partitioning it, in a way, like when I think it was like the Italians took the northern African parts of the Ottomans, and you know, I think it was the UK or France kind of started seizing the Suez Egypt canal. Like, once Europe just stopped kind of fully fighting each other and became a lot less, more tolerant, the Ottomans kind of lost a lot of their early advantage that they got when Europe was just a complete mess and fight and against one another, So yeah.
massive hit to the Ottoman prestige when they were defeated by the Russians in war. The Russians annexed Ottoman lands in the Ukraine and the Crimea, but there's an often overlooked part of this war that arguably might have done even more damage. The peace agreement included a clause that assigned and guaranteed to Russia the role of being the protector of Christians within the Ottoman Empire. And by that extent, since the Ottoman Sultan was also the Caliph, Russia was the protector of Christianity in the entire Islamic world. If you were a Christian in the Ottoman Empire, you were suddenly not only able to find the same degree of condescending tolerance abroad, but you now had nations abroad that took a vested supposed interest in your well-being, who stood up for you against your overlord in case said overlord may act capriciously against you, or at least on the surface. In reality, this clause was more of a crowbar with which Russia could insert itself into Ottoman affairs as a justification for future wars. Nonetheless, this started changing minds. Why should I pay more taxes, be denied equal legal protection, and live my life being constantly degraded as a heretic to a dominant faith? And the final nail in the coffin of the Ottoman social structure came from France, when the French beheaded their king, had somewhat of a revolution, and declared the emancipation of the Jews, with proclaiming that all men were equal, that all had inherent equal rights and liberties no matter their background, ethnicity, faith, or lack thereof. There is a difference between being tolerated and having rights. And with this event, the Ottoman Islamic social structures turned to many into an outdated relic.
So basically, once Europe got its act together, everything fell apart. I know, oversimplified. I meant that more like in a jokish way, but yeah, once Europe got its act together, everything fell apart for the Ottomans. But that's an interesting part of their decline, I think,
Of the past.
Yes, the sick man of Europe, the famous saying.
When Tsar Peter I of Russia, also known as the Great, died in 1725, he left behind a last will and testament unlike any other Tsars before him. It was meant to be shown not just to his direct successor, but to be read by each and every single Tsar or Tsarina after him the moment they ascended to the throne. It wasn't something that he had left behind for them, but a simple instruction: go and conquer Constantinople. The 1800s were a century of imperial expansion and nationalist separatism. Powerful states and ideas would equally come down on the Ottomans with intense pressure. And even though they would try to reform and revive their dying empire, they would find themselves unable to avert disaster. The ideas which the French Revolution had spawned of men as equals, a people's right to self-determination, as well as nationalism, came to be the first thing to bite the Ottomans when the Greeks rebelled during their revolution of the 1820s. Foreign interests, however, also played a role in this. The Greeks were initially losing their revolution until foreign powers saw use in a weakened Ottoman Empire and sent their fleets to help the Greeks achieve victory. This was the tipping point. For the first time, a people under Ottoman rule had risen in revolt against its imperial overlords and won their independence. It showed to all the others what was possible. It showed the Europeans that they could expand their influence over the Ottoman Empire by supporting separatism. It showed the Arabs that their overlords were weaker than expected and beatable. Until this moment, the Ottomans might have even still had a chance to turn things around and possibly avoid a total collapse. But from this moment on, it became unavoidable. The Greek Revolution was one of the biggest, if not the biggest nail in the Ottoman coffin. It would form the basis of a new Greek national identity, form the basis of conflict and antagonism that would last to this very day. And from the first Greek day of independence onward, the Ottomans would huddle from one disaster into another. The first to take advantage were the French, who invaded Ottoman Algeria 2 years after Greek independence and made it a colonial province of the French Empire. Also 2 years after Greek independence, the Egyptians revolted, took Jerusalem and Damascus, and gained great autonomy. The Ottomans had to get the British for help to regain control over the Levant, but the British would only do so in exchange for Cyprus. Both had to recognize Egyptian autonomy, marking the first time in centuries that an Arab nation asserted itself again on the world stage, with a ruler intent on modernizing and building a modern Arab monarchy. However, we don't know how that would have gone, as Britain took advantage of this fledgling little new state by occupying it, and Egypt was thereby forced into another empire. 2 years before the end of the Greek Revolution, the Ottomans, in an attempt to clamp down and gain more control over their European lands, cracked down on the Bektashi Muslims of Albania, which resulted in a decade of continuous Albanian uprisings. In 1931, Bosnian Muslim landlords rebelled against land reform. The uprising was brutally crushed, and in an attempt to solve the problem, the Ottomans split the lands up into new administrative sections, giving some of it to their Serbian vassals, which created new problems that themselves kept continuously creating new problems to this day. The Serbs themselves kept having uprisings, and so did the Macedonians, the Montenegrins, the Bulgarians, and the Greeks, who were still under Ottoman rule. All this turmoil and chaos convinced outsiders that this place was falling apart and up for grabs. It also fell into a time of greater Russian imperial ambitions under a growing nationalist pan-Slavic movement, a movement that dreamed of a greater Slavic empire, who referred to Istanbul not as Constantinople, but as Tsaringrad, a future capital for such an empire, proclaiming that the turmoil was proof that the Ottomans were mistreating their Christians and referring to the previously mentioned treaty that gave them the role as the guarantor of safety and protector of Christians in the Islamic world. The Russians invaded in 1854.
Everyone just smelled weakness. It's like sharks when they smell blood in the water. Just like, awesome, everything is up for grabs now. Dang, bro. It's really the nationalism identity, right? Like with the Greeks, like we're Greek, you know, and then like obviously with the Balkan Wars, how Bulgaria and, you know, Serbia and other groups just kind of had their own national identity. The rise of the national identity through culture and language, played such a big part, and like it happened with the Habsburgs too. Like the Austria Empire had to rename itself the Austrian-Hungarian Empire to appease the growing Hungarians, and obviously, you know, the Habsburgs had rule over so many different groups, from Germans to Serbs to Hungarians. But with the rise of the nationalism and the national identity, Austria, the Habsburg Empire, kind of just fell apart. Kind of happened with the Ottomans too, huh? Like, just a multi-ethnical empire just became harder to sustain, as the different ethnicities kind of just wanted their own thing, to be their own thing among their own. So yeah, that's such a unique aspect of their disintegration, right?
During what became known as the Crimean War, and it seemed like the Ottomans were in for the next big disaster, possibly even the final one. However, the Russians may have been correct about the Ottomans falling apart, but they had gotten greedy, and with their invasion that was clearly aimed at Constantinople, they upset the European balance of powers. Those European nations may have hated each other, but they certainly didn't want a massive, overly powerful Russian empire dominating the Mediterranean and the Balkans. So in the end, the Russians accomplished something completely different, something that was almost impossible a year before, an alliance between the British, the French and the Austrians that forced the Russians out of the Balkans, and for good measure also sank the Russian fleet. But the resulting peace agreement exposed how the Ottomans' supposed allies and saviors were in reality just there to snatch bits and pieces for themselves. The British got even more concessions over Cyprus. The French gained the title of protector of Christianity in the Ottoman lands. And they would in the future themselves use it, just like the Russians, as a crowbar to justify wars. And the Ottomans had to give up even more control over Serbia and Romania. By this time, it would take drastic measures to save the empire, which the Ottomans conducted in 1856 by abolishing the Islamic Sharia-based social order, inviting foreigners to help build a new army, restructured the state to have equal direct representation for all ethnic groups, and even built a nice modern palace in European style as they adopted European dress codes. But these changes were mainly cosmetic and didn't have much impact on changing the overall situation, as things continued mostly as usual. Next came a rebellion of Serbs in Herzegovina who had risen up against Bosnian Muslim landlords. The 1860s brought a Greek insurrection in Crete and an uprising of Arabs in Lebanon, and this was followed by the next great disaster. In 1876, the Bulgarians rose up in revolt. Probably sick and tired of it all, the Ottomans made a monumentally stupid and horrible decision. Instead of just putting down the insurrections as they had done so many times before, they sent an army that raped, burnt, robbed, pillaged, slaughtered, and massacred its way through Bulgaria. In an attempt to pacify the place by terrorizing its people, tens of thousands of civilians were slaughtered. What this war is most remembered for are the mass beheadings. Every time an Ottoman army would march into a town, city, or village, all men aged 14 to 50 were gathered together in the town square and beheaded as the town was.
Oh my goodness. Yeah, I'm probably the growing frustration of just how everything is falling apart probably led them to like, alright, if they don't respect us, they will fear us. But as we've seen, overwhelming brutality can actually, in fact, be even worse than just pacifying a place, because it gives people more of a desire to hate you and fight than before. So I'd imagine this must have come back to bite them in the butt, right? To some degree.
Forced to watch. However, by 1876, newspapers were in wide circulation and had become part of everyone's daily life. Most nations had by then agreed to basic sets of rules of war that forbade the intentional slaughter of civilians. French, British, German, Italians, Russian, South American, and American journalists were all over Bulgaria, witnessing and writing about these atrocities. From one end of the world to the other, the news of what the Ottomans were doing spread, and the world united in disgust and condemnation of the Ottomans. Seeing all this, the Russians invaded. And this time, nobody was going to help the Ottomans. This war,
sucks.
the 11th Russo-Turkish War, was an even bigger disaster for the Ottomans than the independence of Greece and all its previous military defeats. In the previous years, the Ottomans had tried to modernize their army, British and American rifles, German artillery, and British ironclad ships. But the Ottomans had not trained their army on how to use modern equipment and still relied on 200-year-old outdated defensive military tactics. They just hunkered down in trenches, hoping the Russians would do suicidal 17th century bayonet charges. Instead, the Russians shelled them into oblivion with modern artillery. The invading Russian army was also welcomed as liberators by the Bulgarians, Romanians, Armenians, and Serbs. The British and French only intervened and stopped the Russians when they were only a few miles away from Istanbul. In the resulting peace treaty, the Russians annexed the last remaining Ottoman lands in the northern Caucasus and East Armenia. Romania declared full independence and became a Russian ally. Montenegro declared independence. Serbia doubled in size, declared full independence, and became a Russian ally. Bulgaria officially became an autonomous state in the Ottoman Empire, but unofficially.
Oh my gosh, everything has just fallen apart. Holy crap. Oh man, dude, this sucks hard for the Ottomans, eh? Just like, wow.
Was independent and allied with Russia. A mass exodus of Muslims fled these new states in what became one of the world's first recorded refugee crises. In total, 1.5 million who swamped the cities of the empire in slums and squalor. The modernized Ottoman Balkan army had been wiped out. The Ottoman buffer between it and Russia was gone. In any future war, the Russians could now just march right up to Istanbul. And it had also started something else. The Armenians had welcomed the invading Russians in eastern Armenia as liberators, and western Armenia was still in the Ottoman Empire. The Russians now declared themselves to be the protectors of the Armenians in that empire. The Ottomans now looked with ever-deepening suspicions on them. Something started happening that would, a few decades down the road, lead to one of the worst crimes of the century.
Oh no.
However, the end of that war gave the Ottomans also a brief respite. And it came through another series of events that started during that war, something unexpected that must have seemed almost comedic at the time. During the war, when the Serbs marched south and doubled their land in size, they invaded Greece. The Austrians threatened them into getting out of Greece, but the Serbs started something else with that. The Ottomans still controlled vast patches of Balkan lands, but in these lands, intoxicated by nationalist delusions of grandeur and even race, Serb, Greek, Bulgarian, and Albanian nationalists started killing each other before the Ottomans were even gone, so they could have more for themselves once those Ottomans were actually gone. For centuries, these people had lived together in peace and harmony, but with the idea of separation also came the need for new ideas, justifications, and fictions around which to unite a new nation around. In that climate, what separated people became more important than what they had in common. And what differentiated people often was arbitrary. Bosnians are not Turks, but Slavs who converted to Islam centuries ago. So are they Serbs of different faith, as some Serb nationalists claim? Or are they foreign invaders, as other Serb nationalists claim? Or something else entirely? Are Slavs that migrated to northern Macedonia Greeks? Are Orthodox Bulgarians Greeks? Who gets what cultural heritage? Should all Slavs be in one state? Should Greece have what it claims to have had 1,000 years ago? As the Ottoman Empire collapsed in the Balkans, the newly emergent entities started engaging each other in hostility. Serbs against Greeks, against Bulgarians, and vice versa, over who the people in the remaining lands were and should be part of. 30 years before the Ottomans had even left those lands. These fights were the forerunners of wars soon to come, but also the harbinger of greater catastrophes to befall the Balkans in the closing years of the 20th century. During the war with Russia, the other European powers met at a conference in Berlin where they divided Africa up amongst themselves, but also secretly divided up the remaining Ottoman lands in Africa without even telling them. The British made Cyprus a full protectorate and occupied Egypt, which was technically still an Ottoman protectorate. The French invaded Tunisia and made it part of their empire. The Ottomans were furious, but there was little to nothing they could do. Within a time period of only 70 years, the once mightiest empire of the hemisphere had shrunken down to a fifth of its...
Oh, that sucks. 70 years is the wild part. Ouch. Yo, I kind of feel bad. Like, I always feel bad whenever I see, like, an empire kind of fall apart. It is a little, I don't know, I guess, it, I don't know, man, hard to watch at times, but, yeah, that's just the way of the world, huh? But dang, dude, that's rough, buddy.
Former size. A quarter of its population was still Christian, but it had lost almost all it had in Europe besides northern Macedonia, northern Greece, Rumelia, and Crete. All its African vassals were gone, with the exception of Libya, which was basically just a scrap of sand and not worth that much. The Caucasus had slipped away into the hands of Russia, who were by now their biggest threat and right at their doorstep. The Mediterranean was now mostly under British control, and in the remaining Arab lands, the empire had lost much of its legitimacy as an Islamic spiritual leader, as the Arabs increasingly turned away to seek new leaders and solutions. In this mess, a group of idealistic young men would lash out in an attempt to save what was left, but in the end, would only bring upon themselves the end of the empire. If you Google the Young Turks, the result you are going to get are mainly these clowns. A group of American left-wing pundits who named their show after the Young Turks. Why you would do that, I don't know. The result, however, is that this is what people think the Young Turks are, when the Young Turks were in fact someone else. It all started in the 1800s. After several military defeats, the Ottomans invited foreign military staff to train their military officers in newly built cadet schools in places like Thessaloniki. A generation of young Turkish officer cadets, as well as a generation of Turkish students of law and medicine, had the opportunity to travel abroad and study the newest insights in technology, military leadership, and laws abroad. And it convinced them that something had to radically change if the empire was to be saved. They formed underground organizations such as the Committee for Union and Progress, but they became more commonly known as the Young Turks. These revolutionaries believed that for the Ottoman Empire to survive, it needed to reform and adapt to a new world where it would take its equal place amongst European empires. At the turn of the century, the Ottoman Empire fell into another period of crisis. The Austrians occupied Bosnia, and dozens of rebellions flared up by Greeks, Armenians, Albanians, Macedonians, and Arabs. Within all this mess, the Young Turks seized the opportunity to seize power in 1908. The Sultan was forced into signing away all political power and reinstate a constitution. The Ottoman Empire became a constitutional monarchy, but in no way became a democratic society. But their ascent to power did not slow down the decline. Instead, it encouraged outsiders to take advantage of the instability. An Albanian uprising, a war with the new Balkan states, and a war with Italy were the result. The Ottomans lost their last lands in the Balkans, as well as Libya and strategically important Aegean islands to the Italians. And the uprising in Albania foreshadowed what was to come in the following decade. After crushing the rebellion, the Young Turk government banned the Albanian language, Albanian alphabet, Albanian schools, and Albanian traditional dress. By 1913, power resided with a military triumvirate under the three Young Turk pashas or military leaders, Talat Pasha, Enver Pasha, and Jamal Pasha. And with that, they also increasingly abandoned the idea that an empire of multiple ethnicities and faiths could successfully be preserved. Turkification was instead what they worked towards. As the Young Turks started to build a modern nation-state out of their empire, they sought new ideas and fictions around which to forge their new vision. The old ways, the ways of the religious hierarchy and Sharia, had to go. But what do we replace it with? The Young Turks adopted a nationalism through which they saw peoples in ethnic and lingual categories and classifications. They started using the word Turk when describing themselves and the land most Turks lived in. While the Ottoman nobility may have spoken Persian, the Young Turks popularized the use of the Turkish language as a rebellion against the corrupt royal elites. This was an era of nationalist movements across the world, trying to reaffirm and reassess cultural independence and identity. In Ireland, Gaelic cultural organizations formed, and playwrights wrote pieces like Kathleen Houlihan, which had the distinct purpose of separating Irishness from Britishness and rediscovering and reinventing an Irish cultural identity. In China, nationalists nationalists overthrew the Manchu monarchy and reinvented a new Han-Chinese republican national identity. The Indian National Congress increasingly protested the British presence in India, and what happened in the Ottoman Empire was no different than the child of its time. The Young Turks searched for national figures and heroes to reinvent a Turkish culture. The word Turk comes from a tribal name of the old Turkic era and means strength. They rediscovered a medieval Turkish poet and religious mystic, Yunus Emre, who broke with the standards and customs of his time by refusing to write poetry in Persian and refusing to preach religion in Arabic, instead doing so in the common Turkish language of the peasants. He was declared to be the father of the Turkish language, which, however, isn't really true. He just wrote in Turkish to reach more people. Young Turk leaders and politicians such as Ziya Gökalp defined the new Ottoman Empire as a society consisting of people who speak the same language, have the same education, and are united in their religious and aesthetic ideals. And the problem with that increasingly spreading nationalism was that it left no room for others. Your ethnicity, your language, your faith, and the way you practiced your faith.
Yeah, that really is. Like I said, nationalism and how it affected the Ottomans is so interesting in regards to how, other places in Europe, but how it's affecting them themselves. I mean, it's birthing the Turk identity, I think, as we come to know it, right? But again, the tolerance is kind of being lost, as he mentioned earlier, cultural genocide, which you can see, like, I mean, it's good for those who speak Turks and, identify as Turks, but to everyone else, like, this isn't looking good, you know what I mean? So, yeah, I'm kind of seeing, I'm waiting, I mean, not waiting, but, like, I'm almost just expecting that it was the Armenian genocide that's coming up, right? Like, eesh.
Became increasingly relevant in this society. The Young Turks became increasingly racist over time, looking down on Arabs, Armenians, Greeks, Assyrians, and Alawites with increasing racialized contempt, as a people who supposedly refused to become part of the modern world, or as a foreign and enemy entity from within. With passing time, they became increasingly volatile and also delusional. Enver Pasha dreamt of a great Turkic empire stretching from the Balkans to China that he would conquer for a unified, ethnically Turkish empire. The idea in itself is nonsensical. The Turkic cultural sphere contains various different languages and cultural expressions. Even the notion of a Turkish race, after centuries of assimilations and integrations of different peoples, is purely nonsensical. Yet those facts did not dilute the delusions of grandeur that some within the Young Turk ranks had come to believe. A Turkish empire was to be built, and those within it who were not Turks would have to assimilate into becoming Turks or go. The Young Turks...
Yeah, that's way too extreme, to put it nicely. And, yeah, unrealistic. You can't just get rid of... Yeah, that's a bad one. There, you're kind of seeing the writing on the wall starting to appear, and it's a little concerning. Yeah, they're too radical in this idea. Not, I guess, realistic is the word I'm looking for.
aligned themselves with the German Empire, dressed like German officers and generals, and saw the German Empire as an exemplar model for how to build their new empire. As such, they helped drag the empire into the First World War, which first and foremost exposed one thing: their incompetence. Jamal Pasha marched south, intent to take Egypt from the British, lost, got bogged down, and took out his frustrations by mass hangings of Arabs and Assyrians, which resulted in the Arabs increasingly despising their Turkish overlords. Enver Pasha had the genius idea of invading Russia without preparing for the Russian winter, with predictable results. He came back and instead of taking responsibility, blamed the Armenians.
Oh my gosh. Oh no.
Within the new nationalist vision for the Ottoman Empire the Young Turks had, the Armenians were, by not being Turkish and by not being Muslims, already separated from the remaining population as different. To emphasize the difference, even though claiming to abandon the old hierarchy of the Ottoman Empire, the Young Turks took advantage of it by branding the Armenians as kuffar, or unbelievers, as beneath the Muslim population. The Armenians never rose above the status of being second-class citizens, even as the Ottoman Empire reformed. After the failed rebellions of the late 1800s, even the Young Turks denied them legal rights and equality with the remaining population. As the Ottoman Empire was at war and had suffered significant military defeats, the Armenians were an easy pick as scapegoats for all that had gone wrong. In response to a rebellion in Van that had been artificially aggravated by the Ottoman army, the Interior Minister of War made the decision to mass deport the Armenians. Enver Pasha, on May 2, 1915, gave his seal of approval to this via letter. The Young Turks sought to remove the Armenians for nationalist reasons, on the grounds of removing an ethnicity from their society. But to achieve this, they went by a different means, appealing to the Islamic beliefs of the majority population. They called for a jihad against the non-believers and appealed to people to rid the empire of the kuffar. Lists were made of Armenian intellectuals and community leaders, camps established, soldiers were given orders, militias were armed, and camps built for the purpose. When the order was given, Armenian community leaders and intellectuals in urban areas were arrested and killed. Armenians were forced to leave their towns and deported south into the Syrian desert in forced marches. Up to 1.5 million Armenians died in the deserts of Syria, forced to march through the deserts or left in camps with neither food or water. They succumbed to thirst, hunger, and disease.
Oh my god.
Every genocide has its deniers. However, the traces of what happened cannot simply be wiped.
Yeah, I hate genocide deniers. I think it's just an awful thing. Like, I don't know. Obviously, we can all agree here that genocide is just an awful thing to do, but, you know, it's just shocking that, you know, people could do that and not feel bad. You know, like the Holocaust. There's some idiots who think the Holocaust never happened, and they're stupid people, obviously, but, you know, it's just like, it's just awful, dude. Like, those poor people who didn't deserve any of that. And isn't it like modern day, doesn't the modern day government deny this or something? I could have sworn, like, who said that? I'm not sure. I'll retract that statement if it's wrong, but still, anyone who does, it's just, like, awful to do that to people.
Away. Travel through eastern Anatolia today and you will see the empty Armenian churches wherever you may go. The Armenian genocide is denied by the Turkish government and Turkish academia to this very day, and a society that cannot confront the demons of its past is a society that will be haunted by those demons. As such, we will encounter this genocide again in later chapters. The genocide in the end didn't help the Young Turks change the tide of war. As the Russian Empire collapsed, the Armenians in the east broke off to form their own republic, now even more hostile towards them. The Arabs rebelled en masse and harassed the Ottomans from Arabia to Damascus, something the British would take advantage of. And the British Expeditionary Force took Basra and Baghdad. In the end, the Young Turks only signed their own death warrant with what they had done. The world had noticed what had happened, and for what they had done they would, in case of defeat, not be able to merely surrender, but would be wanted men for the crimes that they had committed.
Rightfully so.
Our story, the story of modern Turkey, begins here on the beach in the Dardanelles, in a place called Gallipoli. And to fully understand and appreciate, we need to go back to be introduced to the man who would make and shape modern Turkey, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. He was born as Mustafa in 1881 in Salonika, which is today's Thessaloniki in modern-day Greece. It might seem weird to you, but in the Ottoman Empire, commoners did not have last names, only the royal family did. Growing up in Ottoman Greece as a Turk would impact his views in later life. The experience of being part of a minority in a majority culture, but also in that he was exposed to the nationalism and ideas of the Greeks around him at the time. Not just if Greece should be an independent state or not, but whether it should be a Hellenic kingdom or a Hellenic republic. In school he would excel at maths and prove to be a very intelligent kid, resulting in his teacher giving him his second name, Kemal, from the Arabic word for excellence. After school he would enroll in an Ottoman military academy in northern Macedonia, and later in the Ottoman Military Staff College in Istanbul, pursuing a career as an army officer. It was through his path through the military institutions of the empire that he met and joined the various revolutionary movements around the Young Turks. He himself also got the chance to travel abroad and also formed revolutionary organizations such as in Damascus, with the intention of reforming the empire. He was in many ways a rebel. He smoked a lot and even drank a lot of alcohol, which was highly forbidden in the empire. He read illegal literature, discussed with his comrades how the empire should be reformed, and at one point even landed in jail for his activities. But there were big differences between him and the other mostly Young Turk officers. Most importantly, he was not a Young Turk. Neither did he believe in their ideas and plans. The Young Turks mainly looked for their inspiration on how to reform the empire to the German Empire and to German nationalism as something to copy. The strict militaristic state hierarchy of what was basically a military dictatorship was in their opinion the only way to save the Ottoman Empire. Mustafa Kemal, however, disagreed. He was more interested in what he had seen in France, in particular the French Republic. He saw the pluralistic political system of the French Republic and its desire for progress and advancement in society and the sciences as a better model to copy. He learned to read and speak French, and as such, while the Young Turks read the translations of Prussian militarists, Mustafa Kemal preferred reading the works of French revolutionary and Enlightenment philosophers. In particular, his favorite one, Auguste Comte, a positivist who strictly rejected all forms of metaphysical thought, advocated for the advancement of society in thinking and actions reasoned and based on scientific facts and research, and in particular, advocated for mankind to liberate itself by abandoning all forms of religious ballast and superstition. Generally, in the history of the last 200 years, Comte's writing had more of an impact than most are even aware of. They are basically the foundation of modern French secularism, known as laïcité, and you will find one of his quotes about achieving order and progress, at least partially, on the flag of the Brazilian Republic, whose founders were readers and admirers of Comte. But most significant for our story,
I did not know about this guy.
The political thinking of the young officer cadet Mustafa Kemal. He believed the Young Turks didn't go far enough, that they still clung on to old and outdated traditions, that their thinking was still by and large backward, that the German Empire they modeled themselves after was also backward, and that only radical social and state reforms modeled after European republics such as France would be the solution. You might have even heard or read some of his quotes from this era.
There is only one civilization, the European civilization. There is no second civilization. Civilization is the European civilization. And it must be established here, with all of its thorns and roses.
And there was a second, large point of disagreement between Mustafa Kemal and the Young Turks. And that disagreement was probably the biggest one with which Mustafa Kemal was also largely ahead of his time. He didn't believe that the empire should continue. He believed that the age of empires and colonialism was coming to an end. He also rejected ideas like Enver Pasha's Turanism, the idea of a pan-Turkish empire stretching from China to the Balkans, as fantasies and delusions. Instead, he advocated for a small Turkish solution. The empire should disband, and it should give up rule over the Arabs and the peoples of the Balkans. He also believed that
very interesting and right approach to his thought process. He's realistic, I feel, compared to his contemporaries in that regard. And right.
Empire held nations back, that for the Ottomans being tied into the Islamic world, in particular the Arab world, tied the Turks into religious-based political and social backwardness. Therefore, Turkey should give up the idea of being the leaders of the Islamic world, reject all cultural influences from there, draw borders around the smaller, more compact, and mostly ethnically and lingually unison Turkish homeland, instead of seeking deeper ties into Arabia and Iran, and to build new bridges into Europe and North America and rebuild itself as a modern Turkish nation-state. By the time of the Young Turk coup, Mustafa Kemal had risen to the rank of colonel, and by the entry of the First World War was one of the most experienced military leaders of the Ottoman army, with combat experience in the war with Italy and the Second Balkan War. But because of his beliefs, he was kept away from any political power or even any significant military post. His relationship with the Young Turk government was strenuous at best, but eventually he was given a post commanding a division in Gallipoli, and it was there where he proved his worth. Unlike many of his Young Turk contemporaries, he didn't just dress like a soldier, but actually was one. He had a better understanding of modern warfare and the defensive tactics of trench warfare. When the British sent an army of Australian and New Zealand troops to take the Dardanelles and Istanbul with the intention of knocking the Ottomans out of the war, he correctly anticipated where the attacks would take place, to then organize and command a successful defense and what would be the first Ottoman victory of the war. The victory at Gallipoli changed his prospects, as the German allies, but also the Young Turks, had to recognize his potential. But far more important for later years, the fact that he was fighting in Gallipoli kept him clear of any involvement in the Armenian genocide that was taking place at the same time. He was promoted to general in 1916 and given command of part of the army in the Caucasus, where the Russians had recently launched an invasion of Anatolia. Under his command, the Russians were defeated at Bitlis, halting any further Russian advances. This victory made it abundantly clear that Gallipoli had not been a fluke, and that he was one of the most competent commanders in the Ottoman army, for which by 19...
He's amazing. Definitely he lives up to his given surname of excellence. Yeah, the guy is not only intelligent, realistic, pragmatic, has the right vision, but he's just also great in a militaristic aspect. Good to see why he became like such an important figure. He basically had it all, didn't he? I'm actually really impressed by him. Wow.
17, he was put in charge of Ottoman forces in the Levant, facing the British and the Arab revolt. But there were no victories to be found there. After years of incompetent leadership under Jamal Pasha and his attempts to terrorize the Arabs into obedience, the Ottomans had all but lost control over Arabia. Jerusalem fell to the British, as did Basra and Baghdad, and the Arabs were in full revolt in the remaining lands. By 1918, the Arab revolt had their biggest victory when they took Damascus and started marching on Aleppo. Faced with what would have been certain defeat, Mustafa Kemal decided to instead save his army and organized a retreat back into Anatolia. It was at this point, literally in the same week that Mustafa Kemal retreated his army into Anatolia in fact, that the Sultan, Mehmed VI, reached out to the Allied powers for peace and had an armistice signed. The three Young Turk Pashas, who had dragged the Ottoman Empire into this catastrophe in the first place, as well as conducted the Armenian genocide, all fled abroad to escape being held accountable. Which in the end didn't help them much. Talat Pasha was shot dead by an Armenian in Berlin in 1921. Enver Pasha was killed by an Armenian Red Army officer in the Caucasus in 1922. Jamal Pasha was killed in Georgia in 1922 by a group of free Armenians. And many other senior Young Turk figures involved in the Armenian genocide who had fled abroad were killed by Armenians. It is also often forgotten today that in the aftermath of the war, legal action was taken against many of the Ottoman officials who had partaken in the Armenian genocide in the defeated Ottoman Empire. This was demanded by the Allies and also endorsed by Mustafa Kemal, who wrote,
"It is our main wish that the rule of law be applied impartially, and that complete justice begins. Since the responsibility in our country is equally shared by young and old, the punishment should not only remain on paper, thereby remaining only propaganda which can lead to many unnecessary discussions, but should be carried out, since this would successfully impress the foreign element."
The court-martials set up by the Istanbul and Ankara governments were, however, lackluster, designed in a way that cabinet members could influence outcomes and sentencing, and many of those involved managed to escape punishment. By 1920, in the Paris suburb of Sèvres, Sultan Mehmed VI was made to sign the Treaty of Sèvres. A peace treaty even harsher than the Treaty of Versailles was on the Germans. The Ottoman Empire's lands in Arabia were to be divided up between the British and the French. Eastern Anatolia would be divided up amongst the newly formed Armenian Republic and the new Kurdish state. Southern Anatolia would be given to the French. Eastern Anatolia divided amongst the Italians and Greeks. The Dardanelles and Istanbul would become a formerly international zone, however under British occupation, so basically part of the British Empire. The Turks would be restricted to a small remaining rump state in northern Anatolia, which was 15% of what...
That is brutal. It basically dismantled the empire, essentially, right? That is so brutal.
The empire was before the war, and under a de facto colonial supervision. Adding to that were crippling reparations, and it became abundantly clear that the Turks were to have their lands divided up as colonies to the victors. This treaty was unacceptable to Mustafa Kemal, who in mid-1919 was tasked with reorganizing the Ottoman army to crush any resistance against the treaty and the Sultan in the remaining rump state. Instead, he assembled a congress and from the small town of Ankara declared independence from the Sultan's government and proclaimed to resist the foreign occupation of Anatolia, beginning the Turkish War of Independence. That war, from the onset, seemed absolutely hopeless. The Turks were on their own and pretty much surrounded. The Greeks used this crisis to invade Anatolia in an attempt to build a greater Greece. The Armenians also invaded in an attempt to take the lands inhabited by Armenians before the genocide. The French army occupied vast parts of southern Anatolia, intent on dismantling Ottoman state and cultural structures. A large British fleet was anchored in Istanbul, and the Kurds by now were eager to build their own promised state. But a series of events at the beginning of this conflict pushed things into Mustafa Kemal's favor. The British found oil in the Kurdish homelands of northern Mesopotamia, which led to them betraying the Kurds. Instead of giving them their own homeland, they clustered them into the new colonial administration of Iraq under Arab overlords.
Dang,
the remaining Kurds in Anatolia consequently sided with Mustafa Kemal, who promised them equality under Turkish rule and the resurrection of the Caliphate. Things looked far tougher in the east, as the Turks seemed to be in for a long protracted war with the Armenians. However, in 1920, out of the blue, the Soviet Union invaded Armenia and annexed it. With that, there were no more threats from the east. To the south, the French got bogged down in the guerrilla war with the local Turkish population, and in early 1920 were defeated by the Turkish National Army under Mustafa Kemal's command, leaving them with no other choice but to retreat back into French-occupied.
Yeah, that's the wild part. When we covered the Turkish War of Independence, despite how the odds were stacked against him, Mustafa just defied all the odds and just basically beat them. It's kind of amazing, actually. Attaboy, or should I say Atatürk, but it really was actually amazing. He overcame all the odds and established modern Turkey. You can see why he's called isn't that what Atatürk means? Father of the Turks or something like that. But you can see why he earned that title. Amazing guy. Just a genius all around. His vision for the future, I agreed with. It was practical, realistic, and in terms of military success, the man was also a genius. Really just the perfect leader you could ask for in this time. I'm really happy to have looked more deeper and got to know more about him at this point, because he really is great.
Syria. By far the biggest threat were the Greeks, who seized control of Anatolian lands that were actually promised to the Italians and marched into central Anatolia with one victory after another. The Greeks got close to taking Ankara but were halted and pushed back by 1921 under Mustafa Kemal's command. The war ended in 1922 with the Greeks retreating and the burning of the Greek city of Smyrna, which would later be rebuilt and renamed to Izmir. The end of the war with the Greeks pretty much solidified a Turkish victory, and the British, rather than fight, decided to abandon Istanbul and make peace with the Turks. This victory was a triumph that would cement Mustafa Kemal as a national hero even before he had established his state. There are only 5 countries in the world that avoided being colonized, most through concessions and alliances with other empires or by becoming colonial empires themselves. Turkey is unique amongst them. in that under Mustafa Kemal's leadership it is the only one which managed to avoid colonization by fighting those who sought to colonize it, and more importantly, doing so on its own and outnumbered.
That's
It made
beyond
Mustafa
impressive.
Kemal the savior of the nation and the revered leader and anti-colonial hero, even outside of Turkey, where many leaders in Arabia, Iran and Pakistan would seek to copy him in the future. This war, however, also significantly changed the social makeup of Anatolia. There used to be a Greek population of up to 2 million people in Anatolia before the First World War, and with the burning of Izmir, the last big Greek population center disappeared. You can today still travel throughout the coastlines of Anatolia, and you will find empty Greek towns and villages whose population packed and fled between 1914 and 1922. In the peace agreement, the League of Nations ordered a population exchange. 1.5 million Greeks were to leave Turkey and head for Greece, while 1 million Turks were to leave Greece and head for Turkey. It is important to note that today this would be considered to be ethnic cleansing, but at the time it was seen as a legitimate policy measure to guarantee peace. But, as we would see later, it didn't. What it did, however, do was change Anatolia, which for millennia had been a place of multiple cultures and faiths. The Christian population was reduced to a mere 2%, and the Anatolia Mustafa Kemal inherited was a by and large ethnically and religiously monomorphic society of Sunni Muslim Turks. Thousands of these Turks watched in late 1923 as the last British ships and troops left Istanbul. They all still wore the traditional Islamic headdress for men called the fez. Most of them probably had no idea that they were witnessing the dawn of a new age and the radical break with the past, unprecedented not just for Turkey, but in all of human history. On the 29th of October 1923, the Turkish Republic was declared after the Sultanate had been abolished in the previous year. The only thing that this republic would keep from the past was the flag.
The politician who needs help of religion to govern is nothing but an idiot. For more than 500 years, the rules and theories of ancient Arabic sheikhs, Muhammad, and the absurd interpretations by generations of filthy and ignorant clergy in Turkey dictated all civil and criminal law. They dictated the state from the Constitution, the smallest of activities and gestures of citizens, their diet, the hours of rest and labor, the choice of clothing, the curriculum in schools, our manners and habits, and even our most intimate thoughts. Islam is a rotting corpse that is poisoning all of our lives. There are many different nations, but there is only one civilization. A prerequisite for the progress within a nation is to be a part of that civilization. There are no differences between the Orient and the Occident. There is only a difference between backwardsness and modernity.
The fez was a traditional Islamic headdress worn by men across the Islamic world. It originated in North Africa, and throughout the 17th and 18th century it became increasingly widespread throughout the Islamic world. From Indonesia to Morocco, devout Muslim men would wear it, just as devout Muslim women would wear the veil. It became the official headgear of the Ottoman army uniform, and even non-Muslims who resided within the Ottoman Empire and Muslims who lived outside of the Ottoman Empire would wear it. It signified loyalty to the Caliph, the Islamic social order, the Ummah, and the Caliph's authority over the Islamic world. You can see the fez on the heads of the cheering crowds as the Turkish Republic is founded in 1923. At that time, 80% of that republic's population lived in the countryside. 90% could neither read nor write. Ideas such as nationalism, republicanism, liberalism, progress, modernity, science, or secularism were something most people had never even heard of. A national identity didn't exist, and most group identities were restricted to clans, religious groups, and family structures within rural villages. This was not a population that could carry and advance a revolution, especially since they wouldn't even understand what a revolution was or what they were doing it for, which consequently would shape what Atatürk's revolution would be, one dictated from the top to bottom, and not the other way around as revolutions usually go. This in return would leave behind a legacy of governance enforced autocratically from top to bottom, no matter what the wider rabble may think of it. Within a period of 14 years, the world of the average Turk was turned completely on its head. On the 3rd of March 1924, Mustafa Kemal formally abolished the caliphate. This might seem like nothing to you from an outsider's perspective, but remember, the Sultan and the Caliph were two separate institutions. The Sultanate had been abolished 2 years before with the founding of the Republic, but the Caliphate had still existed. There were many sultans throughout the Islamic world throughout its history, but there could only ever be one caliph. The caliph was not a pope of the Islamic world, but considered to be the spiritual descendant of Muhammad and to represent his authority as a religious authority to all Muslims. The caliphate had existed since Islam itself existed. The title had gone from the Umayyads to the Abbasids to the Ottomans, and was seen as an integral part of the Islamic faith and the understanding of the Ummah as a community of Muslims in the world under a leader. And with one stroke of a pen and the presidential proclamation, Mustafa Kemal...
Wow, I'm grateful you put it in that perspective, because yeah, I was like, oh, that alright, get rid of the caliph. But now that he's put it into perspective of how big of a move that is, wow, that is quite the radical jump, isn't it? And an end to such a long-standing force. That is a very big move.
Kemal abolished it. Gone was a central element of the Islamic world, an authority to all Muslims and their understanding of themselves as a group identity and part of a community that had existed for over 1,000 years. The consequences of this decision were monumental. Mustafa Kemal had promised the Kurds to protect the caliphate in the War of Independence, which resulted in the first split between the Kurds and the Turks. But the consequences were even larger beyond the Turkish Republic. It completely shattered a key element in how many people in the Muslim world saw and understood themselves. What are we now? Who are we? What is our tribe? Our identity, our community? Are we still Muslims? Can Islam persist without the caliphate? Are we nationalities? Are we Asians? Are we Africans? Are we Arabs? Are we Iranian? Are we races? Are we comrades? Are we a community? Can Jews or Christians be part of our community? Can we live with Hindus? Are we kings? Are we republicans? Are we back in the 6th century? What? Where? Who? How? Many, if not most, of the problems throughout the Islamic countries in identity, politics, and nationality can be traced back to this fateful moment. From Gamal Abdel Nasser's proclamations of Arab nationalism, to Iran's Shah proclaiming himself to be a living god, to Jinnah founding a separate Muslim nation in India, to anti-Semitic pogroms in Iraq and Morocco, to the Saudis dragging their society back into the late Iron Age. On the 4th of April 1996, when Mohammed Omar founded the Taliban, he broke open the chest of the cloak inside the Shrine of the Cloak in Kandahar, Afghanistan, where Muhammad's cloak had been kept for centuries, and wrapped himself in it, proclaimed before his followers that he was the legitimate representative of Muhammad, the Caliph of all Muslims, leader of the new caliphate, and that the false gods of nationalism, democracy, and communism had failed. Events echoed when bin Laden proclaimed his war to restore the caliphate to the black flags recently flying over Iraq and Syria. It is still too early to say what the full consequences of Mustafa Kemal's decision were when he abolished an institution that he thought of as...
Yes, but the effects are long held and will continue to be, right? For many more years to come. That puts in such great perspective. Like I said, I'm like really, like my mind is blown at the moment, realizing the magnitude of this move from him and just how it affected so much identity. Like, yeah, wow.
Too backwards to be reformed and therefore had to be destroyed. But make no mistake about the tremendous impact that this decision had throughout the world. But for Mustafa Kemal, that decision was just the starting shot. He followed it up by banning the fez, turbans, niqab, and burqa and the criminal penalty. The hijab was banned in public spaces such as schools and government buildings, and women who throughout most of the history of the Islamic world had been silent figures forced into the background by religion were told to come forward and be public beings and figures. This was followed by the closing of all Islamic schools. Keep in mind that at the time all schools were Islamic schools, and the Sunni clergy held a monopoly on education. This was now over. New schools were opened. The curriculum was entirely secular.
Dang, bro, these reforms are wild. This guy's going for it all. He's like, complete 180. Just so much change in his lifetime. Imagine, like, living through this. Just the amount of change that would just happen in one lifetime would be so staggering, right? Dang, man, he's just getting started. He's like, no, everything's changing. Quite the reformer, eh?
Religion was scrapped entirely out of education, and education was compulsory, and far more radical. It was also compulsory for girls, who had previously, due to Islamic customs, been denied any and all education. This was followed by all women being granted and guaranteed legal equality before the law, and that was followed by the abolition of the Islamic calendar. It was no longer the year 1344, but the year 1925, as it was throughout the rest of the non-Muslim world. Next, he abolished Sharia law in its totality in each and every corner of the legal code, be it civil or criminal law. No more special taxes for non-Muslims, no more restrictions of freedoms, no more prohibition of alcohol, no more punishments for apostasy or other. He introduced freedom of consciousness, making it possible for Muslims to convert to other faiths, or even openly leave their faith and be open atheists. Marriages between faiths and lack of faiths were now legal without a spouse being forced to convert, as it would have been under Sharia. Mixed faith couples could now raise children together, which was forbidden under Sharia. The Islamic courts, Sharia justices, and the Sheikhul Islam, the highest religious legal authority in the land, were all abolished. He introduced a civil code of criminal and civil laws, shaped after examples set in Europe and North America, the first, and so far, only majority Muslim country to ever do so. Next, he banned the call to prayer from minarets at mosques. Next, all imams became state bureaucrats on government payroll, under control by a secular government institution. What could and could not be preached during religious sermons had to be approved by the state. Preaching in Arabic was abolished and had to be conducted in the Turkish language. Next, the Turkish alphabet was Latinized. The old Persian Arabic alphabet was replaced at all state and commercial institutions and schools. All adults who could read and write had to learn the new alphabet. All who couldn't read or write were taught to read and write with the new alphabet. All children would be raised with the new alphabet. Government advisors cautioned Mustafa Kemal to do this slowly and that it could only be done over the course of a decade. But Mustafa Kemal persisted and had this reform pushed through in 5 months. Next,
wow,
all Turks had to take...
Dude, this man's non-stop. He's just going for it. I'm amazed by him. Wow.
Last names. Until then, people throughout the Islamic world had mostly only had 1 or 2 names, but there was no such thing as a last name or a family name. Mustafa Kemal changed that and took the last name Atatürk, which means the father of the Turks. He was the only one to take this name, and since he had no children, he would, in Turkish history, be the one and only father of the Turks. Next, Islam as the official religion of the state
that
was
goes
cut
hard
out of the Republic's constitution. This was then followed by secularism being written into the constitution, defining the Turkish Republic as a state that separates religion and state. And there's a note to be made here. The Turkish word for secularism is laikik, which is a francophone, a French loanword in the Turkish language based on the French term laïcité. And that is important because French secularism isn't your average secularism. While most modern republics define the separation of religion and state as a freedom of religion, in which citizens are free to worship, believe and practice their faith, and even base their politics on their religious beliefs as long as they don't force them upon others, French separation of religion and state, which is called laïcité, is defined as freedom from religion, in that you, the citizen, are freed from religion by the state. It bans religious dress from all government and public institutions, be they parliament or school. It forbids any and all religiously inspired or dictated social policy, be they through private organizations or elected officials. This unique uniquely French interpretation of secularism derived from the French revolutions and its thinkers like Auguste Comte is controversial to this day, as it gives the French government the authority to restrict religious expression in public, such as banning the burkini and burqa under criminal penalty. It also gives the French authorities the power to restrict private religious programs and activities that the state determined to contravene the common good. For example, offering a pseudo-medical procedure known as gay conversion therapy in France is punished with a $60,000 fine and a 2-year prison sentence. Laïcité is far more invasive and has a more hands-on approach to the separation of state and religion than in most other republics and democracies. And it is this type of separation of religion and state which Atatürk adopted for his new republic. Turkish society was torn down to then be rebuilt and modeled after the European states of the time. But Atatürk didn't just want to catch up with the modernity of his neighbors, he wanted to outdo them. But where could he? In what regard were European and American nations still lagging behind in progress? These were for most modern states technologically advanced with legal equality for all men, but mostly only for men. At the turn of the decade, women's equality movements had sprung into action as they had never before in human history. This is where Atatürk saw an opportunity to show off the progress of his new society to the outside world, and to even hint on how his new republic might soon overtake all the others. In the decades before, the Ottomans had made a point of showing off their princes to the outside world as symbols of the empire. Atatürk turned this on its head. He adopted several young girls who showed promise in education and accomplishments, such as Afet İnan and Sabiha Gökçen.
He's very progressive. I like that. He's like really, like, in his way to change, especially like, right, the women didn't get the, at least here in America, like voting stuff until like the 1920s. So the fact that he's like, he's very progressive in many ways in his thinking and in his in implementing his many ideas. Yeah, a very progressive guy.
Afet İnan became an accomplished anthropologist and historian. Sabiha Gökçen became the world's first Air Force pilot, and they both were presented throughout the world as symbols of progress within the Turkish Republic. Most countries represent themselves through national symbols, such as a national animal. Within this concept of national symbols, France is unique as it represents itself as a woman, the famous Marianne, leading the revolution. Atatürk decided that the symbol of Turkey was to be a modern, dark-haired Turkish woman leading the nation to progress. These were the images that Atatürk wanted the world to see. No longer should Turkey be seen as this weird backward nation where veiled women are hidden behind closed doors, but a forward-thinking republic where a female president of a university and acclaimed historian can congratulate American women on receiving the right to vote and finally being the equals of their Turkish sisters.
Dang.
Kadınlığını takdir ederim. Çünkü siyasi haklarını tamamen kazanmışlardır. Türk kadınları da şimdiye kadar aldıkları haklarıyla iktifa etmeyeceklerdir.
One of Atatürk's biggest projects was his new capital. At first, there was confusion when he moved the capital from Istanbul to Ankara. Istanbul had been one of the world's most important metropolis for millennia. Ankara was comparatively nothing, a small town with a population of barely 30,000. But this was done for good reason. Compared to Istanbul, which had geographically been a central location in the larger empire, Ankara was geographically more central within the geography of the new republic. It was easier to access, had the only rail network leading into the south, and contained the headquarters of the army. But more importantly, the small size also served another purpose for Atatürk. He could build a new city for a new state in a new century. At a time when modernist architects were persecuted by fascists.
Yeah, he really pulled them from, like, some of their ideas which were outdated by hundreds of years. He really pulled them in his lifetime, Turkey, into the modern century, the modern world, and at times even outdid people like America in regards to women's rights. And again, like, Americans, especially nowadays, like to be, oh, we're really progressive, but like in some ways we haven't been. And it's cool to see, like, at one point where everyone looked at, you know, Turkey and the Ottomans so far behind, now in ways catching up. it really is just impressive that he did all this in his lifetime. Changes that you think would take decades, right? Or a long time to accomplish. He's knocking them out of the park like in his time, you know? So that's really the part that gets me, how quick he's moving. Like, I'm like, dude, like, how jarring it must have been just to been there, right? Like, through all this, like, it's kind of amazing, right? I wonder what, like, the average person thought of so much radical change.
Movements in Europe, Atatürk invited many of them, such as Bruno Taut, Clemens Holzmeister, and Paul Bonatz, to come into a Turkish exile and build a new capital with him. What they built was the futuristic Ankara that we know today. Detached from many concepts of traditional Middle Eastern style of buildings, a modern European metropolis was stamped out of the ground. If you visit the city today, you will find the symbols of another cultural revolution that took place here, manifested in architecture. Best symbolized with the Road of Lions, because these lions are imitations of 10,000-year-old Hittite bronze figurines. Adding to that, the coat of arms that Atatürk chose for his new city was a Hittite sun wheel, and the Road of Lions is also not far away from the newly built Turkish National Museum, filled with Hittite, Assyrian, Persian, Greek, Roman, and nomadic artifacts. This might seem small to you from an outsider's perspective, but symbolized another monumental break from traditions and customs in Islamic societies. Before Atatürk, pre-Islamic cultures and relics were considered to be barbaric or even as sacrilegious or demonic by Islamic societies. In Arabia, ancient pre-Islamic castles and temples are being destroyed to this very day. Atatürk's new vision for his new state required the forging of a new national Turkish identity, and that new identity based on nationality, heritage, and language made the ancient pre-Islamic civilizations part of that national identity. The Turks were to no longer just see themselves and identify themselves as just a part of a wider Islamic community, but to take pride in an identity with a wider historic legacy that included nomadic horsemen and ancient Anatolian civilizations.
That's very beautiful, and that's a great way to preserve history, like being proud of, like I said, we mentioned so much earlier how much different cultures and influences created such a huge, diverse place of Anatolia with all these empires and civilizations who all stationed themselves there. That's a great way to preserve, like, yeah, let's not ignore all that, Anatolia is a historically and culturally rich place. Like, you should be proud of that. And that's great. Dude, I love this man. I'm falling in love falling in love with this dude for his genius and his great way of thinking, which I just find myself completely like, dang, dude, this guy's just he really is just great. I don't know what other adjective to use, but he's great. Oh, we're almost done, thank God. I'm, like, getting tired.
All of these reforms,
but I'm enjoying the video. I don't want anyone to think I hate the video, I swear. I'm actually I'm loving it. It's just, like, again, I'm not the fondest of sitting down for a while. But you know what? This is still worth it. And, man, I'm enjoying the video very much.
Restructuring and reorganizing of a society in such a radical way, like it had almost never been done before or since in human history, happened within 14 years, between 1923 and
14 oh my gosh. That is quick. Some places take forever to change. He did it in 14 Genius. The man's a genius. I don't know what else you can say. He's a genius!
1937. The goal behind them was to create a modern state shaped after a European republic. But precisely the problem there is that republics are more often than not societies with a right to self-determination for the individual. Ask yourself this: is a society that forces you to not be religious any better than a society that forces you to be religious? You might find forced political religiosity and religious doctrine more contemptible than forced secularism, but a key component in both remains the force. Erziehungsdiktatur is a term coined by the German historian Harald Neubert, who spent the final years of his academic career trying to figure out why the Soviet Union had failed. The word basically translates to educational dictatorship, or the educating dictatorship. The idea is that the state was ruled by an ideological minority who found their legitimacy not through public approval but within their own beliefs, and saw it as their role to rule as dictators until the public would finally be educated enough to see the validity of those beliefs and elect them through their own volition. However, in the Soviet Union, the dictatorial experience merely educated the people into rejecting that ideology. Atatürk's state was in many ways such an educational dictatorship. Atatürk saw himself as the first and last dictator of Turkey, the one dictator that the nation needed to educate it into never having another dictator again after him. The problem he had was putting this into effect. In 1925, he encouraged opposition figures to found a liberal opposition party with the intention of gradually democratizing society. However, seeing this as a weakness, disgruntled remnants of the Young Turks attempted to assassinate him, and the Kurdish Sheikh Said launched a rebellion to overthrow the republic, to reinstitute Sharia and re-establish the caliphate. The project of Turkish democracy was put on rest, and Atatürk responded with harsh measures, executing the remaining Young Turk leaders and launching a heavy military crackdown against the Kurds. It was after this backlash that he somewhat backtracked his previously more radical positions.
We believe that religion, which for the longest times has been used as an instrument of politics, must be liberated from politics to be elevated. We cannot abuse our holy faiths as instruments of politics.
It is unclear how sincere he may have been when making this statement. Atatürk himself had stopped practicing Islam in 1923, but besides the conflict with the religious population, the Kurdish uprising of 1925 also exposed other problems with the new vision of the Turkish national identity. The fact that it was built on a new nationalist identity formed exclusively around the Turkish language, heritage and culture. It left no room for Kurds, thereby sowing the seeds for inevitable future conflicts. It was an idea that left no room for any cultural, lingual and to some extent even political aberrations. However, the pluralism that Atatürk wished for this society to achieve requires such aberrations and diversity to exist. To ensure that his vision for the future after him would be safe, Atatürk established the National Security Council, an institution of generals that had the expressed permission to intervene in the politics of the country by force if the constitution of the secular republic was ever under threat of being undermined. A role usually given to civil opposition, and the Supreme Court was thereby handed to the army, guaranteeing even more future conflict potential. The cracks in all of this would show at some point. Decades later, it would be revealed that Sabiha Gökçen, the war hero, a national symbol of Turkish social progress, was actually an Armenian, a genocide survivor adopted from an orphanage by Atatürk.
Oh,
the
wow.
diversity in this society was still there, it was just hidden behind the scenes. Mustafa Kemal Atatürk died on the 10th of November 1938 at 9:05 in the morning. It is an easy historic date and time to remember, because every year on the 10th of November at 9:05 in the morning, the sirens go off in all Turkish cities and towns, and everyone stops in their tracks for a minute of silence. For outsiders, it all might seem somewhat weird to observe, almost like a personality cult in a dictatorship.
Yeah, it is a great amount of respect that it's something that's still done, right? And you can see why he's revered. I mean, look at his accomplishments in his lifetime. Like, you can definitely understand exactly why, you know, this deep... Like, even I have, like, a lot of respect for a lot of what he did. You can see why, you know? I don't know, I think it's kind of a cool aspect of it, you know, like kind of a cool act of respect that they do to honor him.
But this is really not the case. Atatürk is genuinely revered by the Turkish people, who to this day see him as the savior of their nation and the founder of their modern society. To this day, they go to his memorial in Ankara in the millions to pay their respects. Years ago, when I first looked into this topic and had a conversation with a Turkish friend, I commented on how weird it was to me that Mustafa Kemal called himself the father of the Turks, and was abruptly interrupted by a "No, we call him the father of the Turks." As we go forward into the story of the Republic, you will find that Atatürk's shadow dominates over this state and its people throughout their journey through the 20th century. No other political figure would have as much of an impact on this country as he did, until 2003.
Yeah, as of right now, there's another part, a part 2, that it's about the journey of the Republic, which we will cover tomorrow. I've been here for quite a bit. I'm a little exhausted. Like I said, I'm not used to fully sitting down for long recordings, so yeah, I'm gonna end it right here. Overall, a great video, and I can't wait to see part 2 tomorrow. Bye, everyone.